For decades, there was a silence around Neuengamme, no towering gas chambers, no infamous photographs taught in classrooms, no single image burned into the world's memory. And yet, more than 100,000 people passed through this place, and nearly half of them never left. Neuengamme was not built to shock the world. It was built to disappear into it. Hidden near the river Elbe, outside Hamburg, this camp became a factory of slow destruction, a place where prisoners were worked, starved, beaten, and exhausted to death in brickworks, armament plants, shipyards, and construction sites that helped sustain Nazi Germany's war machine. Here, death did not always come suddenly. It came quietly, through hunger, through disease, through endless labor that broke the body long before it ended life. Neuengamme was a camp without spectacle, and that was its power. Its crimes were buried under paperwork, contracts, production quotas, and post-war denial. After the war, the camp was dismantled, repurposed, and built over. For years, schools and prisons stood where barracks once held the dying. This documentary tells the complete history of Neuengamme, from its creation as a small satellite camp to its expansion into one of the largest concentration camp systems in northern Germany. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Origins of Neuengamme. Neuengamme did not begin as a place of mass death. Like many of the Nazi camp system's most lethal sites, it began quietly, almost invisibly, as a small extension of an already existing machinery of repression. In the spring of 1938, as Nazi Germany accelerated its rearmament and expansion, the SS leadership searched for new ways to extract labor from the growing population of prisoners held in concentration camps. Sachsenhausen, near Berlin, was overcrowded, and its prisoners were already being leased out for construction and industrial projects. It was from Sachsenhausen that the first group of prisoners was transported north, to a disused brick factory near the village of Neuengamme, just outside Hamburg. Officially, this was a satellite labor detachment. In reality, it was the seed of a new camp, planted deliberately in a region rich in waterways, transport routes, and industrial demand. The Nazis did not choose Neuengamme at random. Hamburg was one of Germany's most important port cities, central to shipbuilding, trade, and later, the war economy. The nearby clay deposits made brick production easy, and bricks were essential for the monumental construction projects envisioned by the regime. The SS-owned company Deutsche Erd und Steinwerk had been created precisely for this purpose, to turn prisoner labor into profit. From the very beginning, Neuengamme existed at the intersection of ideology and economics, where political repression and industrial exploitation reinforced one another. The men sent there in 1938 were primarily German political prisoners, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, already marked as enemies of the state. They arrived to find no camp, only overgrown land, decaying buildings, and the ruins of the brickworks. Under guard, they were ordered to clear the area, repair kilns, dredge canals, and construct their own barracks. Every structure that would later confine, punish, and kill was built by the hands of those imprisoned within it. From the outset, violence was routine. Prisoners worked long hours with inadequate food, under constant threat of beatings, humiliation, and arbitrary punishment. The SS guards imposed discipline not through rules, but through terror, making survival dependent on obedience and physical endurance. As the months passed, Neuengamme expanded steadily. What began as a subcamp became an independent concentration camp by 1940, directly under the authority of the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office. Its purpose widened. No longer just brick production, but a flexible reservoir of forced labor for northern Germany. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the prisoner population changed rapidly. As Nazi armies occupied new territories, Neuengamme began to receive prisoners from across Europe. Poles arrested during the occupation, Czech resistance members, Dutch and Belgian political detainees, and later prisoners from France, Scandinavia, and the Soviet Union. Jews, Roma, and so-called asocials were increasingly swept into the camp system as racial policy hardened into genocidal practice. Yet Neuengamme retained a distinctive character. Unlike extermination camps designed primarily for immediate killing, it was structured around labor. Death here was not always the result of a single act, but of a process, a gradual wearing down of the body through starvation, overwork, disease, and exposure. Prisoners were assigned to brick production, canal construction, peat cutting, and later armaments manufacturing. Food rations were calculated not to sustain life, but to extract the maximum amount of work before collapse. Medical care was minimal or non-existent, except when prisoners became subjects of experimentation. Punishment was omnipresent. Floggings, hanging by the arms, confinement in standing cells, and public executions intended to enforce submission. As Neuengamme grew, it developed into the center of a vast network. Dozens of subcamps spread across northern Germany, supplying labor to shipyards, oil refineries, aircraft factories, and construction sites devastated by Allied bombing. Prisoners were transported daily or housed near workplaces, isolated from the outside world, guarded by SS men and civilian overseers alike. This integration of camp labor into civilian industry blurred the boundaries between the SS system and German society. Neuengamme was not hidden deep in a forest, far from view. It existed alongside factories, canals, and towns whose prosperity increasingly depended on the exploitation of prisoners. And yet, after the war, this very integration would make Neuengamme easier to forget. There were no dramatic liberation scenes broadcast around the world, no single moment that fixed it permanently in public memory. Its victims were dispersed across countless work sites. Its crimes spread thinly across years of routine brutality. By the time the camp reached its full scale, Neuengamme had become something more than a camp. It was a system, one that normalized suffering, converted human beings into expendable labor units, and demonstrated how mass violence could be administered quietly, efficiently, and with the cooperation of an entire industrial region. This is where the story of Neuengamme truly begins. Not with spectacle, but with planning. Not with chaos, but with order. Not with a single act of murder, but with a structure designed to make death an expected outcome of work itself. Chapter 1. Segment 2. Building a camp through labor and fear. By the time Neuengamme was formally separated from Sachsenhausen and designated an independent concentration camp, its foundations had already been laid in exhaustion, fear, and silence. The transformation from a small labor detachment into a major camp did not happen overnight. It unfolded through countless days of forced work, each one erasing another piece of the prisoner's strength and identity. The SS understood that a camp did not need grand architecture or elaborate killing facilities to function effectively. What it needed was control over bodies, time, food, and hope. Neuengamme became a laboratory for that control. Prisoners rose before dawn to the sound of whistles and shouted orders, assembled for roll call in all weather, and were marched to their assigned labor sites. Any delay, mistake, or perceived defiance could result in beatings administered publicly, ensuring that punishment served not only to injure the victim but to instruct everyone watching. Hunger was constant. Rations consisted of watery soup, small portions of bread, and occasional scraps of fat or vegetables, never enough to restore the calories burned during 10 to 12 hours of physical labor. As weeks turned into months, bodies grew thinner, faces hollow, movements slower. The SS referred to those no longer able to keep pace as Muselmänner, living corpses whose deaths were considered inevitable and unworthy of concern. The brickworks at Neuengamme were central to this system. Prisoners dug clay, carried heavy loads, operated kilns, and transported bricks by hand, often knee-deep in mud or freezing water. Accidents were frequent and rarely treated. A broken limb could mean a death sentence, as injured prisoners were often beaten for slowing production or left to deteriorate without care. Yet the brutality was not random. It was structured, regulated, and justified through bureaucracy. Work quotas were set. Output was measured. Failure was punished. Success brought no relief, only higher expectations. This methodical cruelty extended into every aspect of camp life. Barracks were overcrowded, poorly heated, and infested with lice, creating ideal conditions for disease. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and later typhus spread rapidly, especially among those weakened by hunger. The camp infirmary, rather than a place of healing, became a sorting mechanism. Prisoners deemed unfit for work were often neglected, experimented upon, or selected for transfer to killing centers under the so-called 14F-13 program, which targeted sick and exhausted inmates for extermination. Discipline inside Neuengamme was reinforced through an internal prisoner hierarchy manipulated by the SS. Kapos, prisoners assigned supervisory roles, were granted limited privileges in exchange for enforcing discipline among their fellow inmates. This system fractured solidarity and redirected violence inward, turning survival into a moral minefield. Some kapos used their position to protect others where possible. Many became instruments of terror themselves, knowing that any show of weakness could result in their own punishment or death. The SS cultivated this ambiguity deliberately. By forcing prisoners to participate in their own oppression, the camp eroded trust and isolated individuals from one another. As Germany moved deeper into war, Neuengamme's importance increased. Hamburg's shipyards, armaments factories, and infrastructure projects demanded labor at a scale the civilian workforce could no longer provide. Allied bombing raids intensified production pressures, and prisoners were increasingly deployed to clear rubble, rebuild damaged facilities, and manufacture weapons under ever more dangerous conditions. Death from exhaustion became routine. So did executions for alleged sabotage, accusations often made without evidence, serving as warnings rather than justice. Public hangings were staged in front of assembled prisoners, their bodies left suspended as visual reminders of the consequences of resistance. Through all of this, Neuengamme remained relatively unknown to the wider German public, yet it was never truly hidden. Local civilians saw prisoners marching under guard, working along canals and roads, and later, housed in subcamps embedded within cities and industrial sites. The camp existed in plain sight, sustained by contracts, supplies, and administrative cooperation that tied it to the surrounding economy. This proximity did not lead to intervention. Instead, it normalized the presence of forced labor and suffering as part of daily life. What Neuengamme demonstrated with chilling clarity was that mass atrocity did not require secrecy alone. It required indifference, routine, and the steady acceptance of human degradation as necessary or unavoidable. By the early 1940s, the camp had become fully integrated into the Nazi system of repression and exploitation, a place where terror was no longer exceptional but expected, where death was not the result of chaos but of order carefully maintained. The prisoners who entered Neuengamme at this stage were not simply detained. They were absorbed into a machine designed to consume them slowly, efficiently, and with minimal attention. This was the environment in which Neuengamme would continue to grow, drawing in tens of thousands more victims as the war expanded. A camp built not only of barbed wire and watchtowers, but of policies that transformed labor into a method of destruction. Chapter 1. Segment 3. From Detention Site to Engine of Destruction. As Neuengamme expanded through the late 1930s and early 1940s, it crossed a decisive threshold, transforming from a brutal labor camp into a fully integrated engine of Nazi terror. This shift was not marked by a single order or construction project, but by a gradual hardening of purpose. The camp's function widened from punishment and exploitation to systematic destruction through labor, neglect, and administrative murder. Each new transport brought prisoners from across occupied Europe, political opponents from Germany, resistance fighters from France and the Netherlands, Poles swept up after mass arrests, Soviet prisoners of war, and later, increasing numbers of Jews deported into a system already calibrated for exhaustion. Upon arrival, prisoners were stripped of names and replaced with numbers, classified by colored triangles stitched to their uniforms. These symbols determined not only their category, but often their chances of survival. The SS treated these classifications as operational data, a way to allocate bodies where they could be used most efficiently before breaking. Neuengamme's bureaucracy grew alongside its population. Offices tracked labor output, sickness rates, and mortality with chilling precision. Deaths were logged as routine losses, comparable to broken tools or worn-out machinery. Cremation capacity expanded, not to honor the dead, but to prevent overcrowding of corpses from disrupting camp operations. Even death had to be managed efficiently. As the war intensified, Neuengamme became central to a vast web of satellite camps stretching across northern Germany. These subcamps supplied forced labor directly to armaments factories, shipyards, construction sites, and chemical plants. Prisoners were no longer confined to the main camp alone. They were dispersed wherever labor was needed, often housed in makeshift barracks, bombed-out buildings, or factory halls. Conditions in these subcamps were frequently worse than in Neuengamme itself. Longer hours, harsher supervision, fewer rations, and almost no medical care. The SS justified this expansion as a wartime necessity, framing prisoners as expendable resources in the struggle for Germany's survival. In reality, the system ensured that very few would survive long enough to see liberation. The logic was circular and ruthless. Weakened prisoners worked less efficiently, which led to punishment, reduced rations, and ultimately death, making room for new arrivals. Violence became both a management tool and an expression of absolute power. Guards enforced discipline through beatings, stress positions, and arbitrary executions. Punishment blocks isolated prisoners in darkness and silence, sometimes for weeks, while roll calls were deliberately prolonged until men collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. These practices were not spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were embedded in regulations and training manuals, passed down as best practices within the SS camp system. Neuengamme thus served not only as a site of suffering, but as a training ground where methods of control were refined and exported. Guards and administrators rotated between camps, carrying lessons learned at Neuengamme to other locations across the Reich. Medical abuse also became a defining feature of this phase. Camp doctors conducted experiments under the guise of research, infecting prisoners with diseases, testing chemical agents, or performing procedures without anesthesia. These experiments were justified as contributions to military medicine, but they relied entirely on the assumption that prisoner lives held no value. Those who survived were often left permanently disabled. Many did not survive at all. The camp infirmary became another filter, separating those still useful from those marked for disposal. Transfers to killing centers, execution by shooting or hanging, and deliberate neglect all functioned as mechanisms to remove the unproductive. Yet even within this system, traces of humanity persisted, fragile, dangerous, and often fatal to express openly. Prisoners formed covert networks, sharing information, food, and support when possible. Political prisoners sometimes organized clandestine resistance, sabotaging production subtly or protecting weaker inmates from immediate punishment. These acts rarely altered the overall machinery of the camp, but they preserved a sense of dignity and moral resistance in an environment designed to erase both. The SS responded with increased surveillance, informants, and collective punishments meant to extinguish solidarity. Entire barracks could be punished for the actions of one individual, reinforcing fear and isolation. By the early 1940s, Neuengamme had fully assumed its role as a camp Germany would later attempt to forget. It produced bricks, weapons, and infrastructure essential to the war effort, while simultaneously consuming tens of thousands of lives. Its crimes were not hidden in remote forests or secret chambers alone. They unfolded through contracts, supply chains, and paperwork that connected the camp directly to German industry and government. This integration made Neuengamme both indispensable and invisible, indispensable to a regime dependent on forced labor, invisible because its violence was normalized as part of wartime necessity. What emerged from this phase was a camp no longer defined merely by imprisonment, but by annihilation through order. Neuengamme demonstrated how a modern state could transform administration, labor management, and industrial planning into tools of mass death without abandoning the appearance of legality. This transformation set the stage for the camp's final years, when collapse, evacuation, and erasure would reveal just how thoroughly human life had been reduced to expendable material within its wire fences. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Prisoners of the System, who was sent to Neuengamme. By the time Neuengamme entered its second phase of existence, it had become a destination for a wide spectrum of people the Nazi regime defined as enemies, obstacles, or disposable labor. Unlike extermination camps designed primarily for immediate mass murder, Neuengamme functioned as a concentration camp whose cruelty lay in duration. People were sent here not to die at once, but to be consumed slowly by a system that extracted every possible ounce of labor before discarding what remained. The composition of the prisoner population reflected the expanding ambitions of the Third Reich and the tightening grip of repression across Europe. In the early years, most inmates were German political prisoners, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and others who had opposed or failed to conform to Nazi rule. Many had already endured interrogations, imprisonment, or torture before arriving, weakened physically and psychologically even before Neuengamme began its work on them. As Germany's war widened, so did the camp's intake. After the invasion of Poland, Polish prisoners began arriving in large numbers. Intellectuals, priests, teachers, and members of the resistance, targeted specifically because they represented leadership and identity within occupied society. They were treated with particular brutality, often assigned the hardest labor, and given lower rations than German prisoners. Language barriers and deliberate isolation made survival even more difficult. With the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Soviet prisoners of war entered the camp system under conditions that bordered on outright execution. Classified by Nazi racial ideology as subhuman, they were starved, exposed, and worked to death at catastrophic rates. Many did not survive their first winter. Jews were present at Neuengamme from early on, but their numbers increased significantly as deportations intensified across occupied Europe. Jewish prisoners were often singled out for especially degrading treatment, subjected to constant abuse by guards and prisoner functionaries alike, and frequently selected for the most dangerous work details. While Neuengamme was not primarily a death camp, Jewish inmates were disproportionately represented among the dead, a result of both deliberate cruelty and structural discrimination embedded in camp life. Roma and Sinti prisoners were also deported to Neuengamme, victims of the same racial policies that sought their eradication across Europe. They were often imprisoned as families before being separated, exploited, and destroyed. As the war dragged on, resistance fighters from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark arrived, many arrested for sabotage, intelligence work, or aiding Allied forces. These prisoners often brought with them a sense of purpose and solidarity, but they were also subjected to severe reprisals meant to break their will and discourage resistance beyond the camp. Women and children, though fewer in number than men in the main camp, were increasingly present in Neuengamme's expanding network of subcamps. Children arrived orphaned, deported with parents who soon perished, or transferred from other camps as the system collapsed under Allied pressure. They were forced into labor far beyond their strength, deprived of education, nutrition, and basic care. Childhood itself was treated as irrelevant. The camp recognized only productivity or uselessness. What unified these disparate groups was not crime or guilt, but categorization. Upon arrival, prisoners were sorted into administrative identities represented by colored triangles. Red for political prisoners, yellow for Jews, green for so-called criminals, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, black for those deemed asocial, and combinations that further marked racial or ideological targeting. These symbols governed every aspect of camp life. They determined work assignments, treatment by guards, access to food, and vulnerability to violence. The system encouraged hierarchy and division among prisoners, deliberately fostering resentment and mistrust. Some inmates were elevated into roles as capos or block elders, forced to enforce discipline under threat of death themselves. This system blurred moral lines, compelling prisoners to choose between collaboration and survival. The SS exploited these divisions ruthlessly, ensuring that resistance was dangerous and rare. Arrival at Neuengamme followed a ritual designed to erase individuality. Prisoners were beaten, shaved, disinfected, and stripped of personal belongings. Names were replaced by numbers. Letters from home were restricted or withheld entirely, severing ties to the outside world. The shock of arrival, combined with hunger, exhaustion, and terror, often broke newcomers within days. Those who failed to adapt quickly were marked as weak and soon disappeared into punishment details, infirmaries that functioned as waiting rooms for death or execution lists. Yet even in this crushing environment, the prisoner population was not static. Transfers in and out of Neuengamme were constant, feeding a vast labor economy that spanned northern Germany. Prisoners were shipped to subcamps near factories, ports, and construction sites, sometimes never seeing the main camp at all. Others were brought in already half-dead from camps in the east as the front lines shifted. Neuengamme thus became both a destination and a transit point, a node in a system that treated human beings as movable, expendable units. The camp's diversity, rather than softening its cruelty, intensified it. Different languages, backgrounds, and survival strategies collided under conditions engineered to produce competition and despair. Yet this same diversity also carried the seeds of resistance and memory. Prisoners shared stories, songs, political ideas, and fragments of identity that the SS could never fully erase. These fragile connections would later become vital sources of testimony, ensuring that Neuengamme's victims would not vanish entirely into statistics. Chapter by chapter, the camp's population reveals the true nature of Nazi terror. Not a single act of violence, but a vast sorting machine that decided who could be worked, who could be discarded, and who would be erased first, all under the guise of order, discipline, and necessity. Chapter 2, Segment 2, Labor as Sentence. How work became a method of destruction. Once prisoners had been sorted, numbered, and stripped of identity, Neuengamme revealed its true purpose. This was not a camp designed around confinement alone. It was a camp built to extract labor until the body failed. Work was not rehabilitation, and it was not punishment in the traditional sense. At Neuengamme, labor was the sentence itself. A slow, grinding process meant to exhaust, weaken, and ultimately destroy. From the earliest days, the SS viewed prisoners as a renewable resource, bodies to be consumed in service of the Reich's economic and military ambitions. Survival depended not on innocence or guilt, but on physical capacity, adaptability, and sheer chance. Every morning began before dawn, with roll calls that could last for hours regardless of weather. Prisoners stood motionless in freezing rain, snow, or heat, while guards counted and recounted bodies, sometimes forcing the living to support the dead so the numbers would match. Collapse during roll call often meant beatings, punishment, labor, or death. Only after this ritual humiliation were work details assigned. The range of labor at Neuengamme was vast, but all of it shared a common feature. It was intentionally brutal. In the early years, much of the work focused on brick production. Prisoners were forced to dig clay, operate heavy machinery, and carry massive loads by hand, often knee-deep in mud or icy water. The brickworks became infamous as a place where strength drained away rapidly. Long hours, minimal tools, and constant abuse ensured that injuries were inevitable. Broken bones, crushed limbs, and untreated wounds were common, and those who could no longer work were quickly removed from the labor pool, usually to die. As the war intensified, Neuengamme's role expanded into armaments production, shipyard labor, and construction projects vital to Germany's wartime economy. Prisoners were sent to factories producing weapons, ammunition, and aircraft components, often working 12 to 14 hours a day under constant supervision. Safety was irrelevant. Explosions, chemical burns, and industrial accidents claimed countless lives. Complaints were treated as sabotage. Fatigue was seen as defiance. Even illness offered no refuge. Sick prisoners were routinely dragged back to work until they collapsed completely. The SS carefully calibrated rations to sustain labor just long enough to extract value. Food was minimal, monotonous, and nutritionally empty: watery soup, a piece of bread, perhaps a smear of margarine. Caloric intake rarely matched the energy expended, ensuring gradual starvation. Prisoners became skeletal, muscles wasting away while they were still expected to perform physically demanding tasks. Hunger dominated every thought. Men fought over crumbs, licked bowls clean, and dreamed obsessively of food. Theft, though punishable by death, became a matter of survival. This constant deprivation was not accidental. It was policy. The camp administration understood precisely how little nourishment was required to keep a body functioning temporarily. Clothing offered little protection. Thin striped uniforms, wooden clogs, and inadequate coats left prisoners exposed to the elements. Winter was especially lethal. Frostbite set in quickly, particularly during outdoor labor details. Toes and fingers blackened and fell away. Infection spread rapidly. Those unable to keep pace were beaten or reassigned to punishment units designed to accelerate death. One such punishment was the assignment to the most grueling details. Carrying heavy loads repeatedly, digging and refilling trenches, or performing pointless tasks meant solely to exhaust. These assignments were often accompanied by arbitrary rules. Prisoners forced to run while carrying bricks, forbidden to rest, or required to maintain impossible postures for hours. Guards derived entertainment from enforcing these routines, turning suffering into spectacle. Medical care existed in name only. The camp infirmary was overcrowded, undersupplied, and often functioned as a sorting station rather than a place of healing. Doctors, some of them SS physicians, evaluated prisoners not based on need, but on usefulness. Those deemed temporarily salvageable might receive minimal treatment, while the rest were marked for transport, lethal injection, or neglect. Experiments were conducted under the guise of research, further blurring the line between medicine and murder. Work continued even during illness, spreading disease rapidly through barracks and labor details. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and pneumonia became constant companions. The structure of labor at Neuengamme also served a psychological purpose. Prisoners were kept in a state of perpetual exhaustion, leaving little energy for resistance or even coherent thought. Days blurred together into an endless cycle of labor, hunger, pain, and fear. Time lost meaning. The future became unimaginable. This mental erosion was as destructive as the physical toll. By breaking bodies, the system also broke spirits. Yet within this machinery of destruction, moments of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared work when they could, subtly supporting the weak, redistributing tasks, or offering whispered encouragement. Skilled workers sometimes tried to shield others by slowing production or falsifying reports, though discovery meant severe punishment. Acts of solidarity were small, fragile, and dangerous, but they mattered. They represented defiance in a system designed to erase compassion. Neuengamme's labor regime exposes a central truth of the Nazi camp system. Genocide was not always immediate or overt. It could be carried out through schedules, quotas, and work assignments. Death did not require gas chambers alone. It could arrive through exhaustion, starvation, and indifference, administered day after day by clerks, guards, and supervisors who treated human lives as units of output. In this way, Neuengamme became a factory of disappearance, a place where people were not simply killed, but consumed by work until nothing remained but numbers crossed off a list. Chapter 2, Segment 3, Punishment, Control, and the Architecture of Fear. If forced labor was the engine of Neuengamme, punishment was the system that kept it running. Control inside the camp did not rely on constant violence alone, but on the certainty that violence could appear at any moment, without warning, reason, or limit. From the day prisoners arrived, they were taught that rules were fluid, enforcement was arbitrary, and survival depended on obedience to an ever-shifting set of expectations. This uncertainty was deliberate. Fear was not a byproduct of the camp system, it was one of its core tools. Discipline at Neuengamme was designed to break resistance before it could form, to turn prisoners inward against themselves, and to ensure that exhaustion was paired with psychological collapse. The SS maintained authority through a hierarchy that extended suffering downward. Prisoner functionaries, capos, block elders, and work detail leaders were granted limited power over others, often selected for their brutality or desperation. This system forced prisoners into impossible moral positions, compelling some to enforce cruelty in order to survive a little longer themselves. Punishment could be triggered by anything: working too slowly, speaking without permission, standing incorrectly during roll call, or failing to meet quotas that were intentionally unattainable. Often, no infraction was required at all. Random violence served as a reminder that safety did not exist. Beatings were public, carried out in front of other prisoners to reinforce obedience. Guards used fists, rifle butts, truncheons, and whips. The goal was not correction, but humiliation and terror. One of the most feared punishments at Neuengamme was the standing cell, a narrow, dark space in which prisoners were confined upright for hours or days, unable to sit or lie down. Others were suspended by their arms behind their backs, a method that dislocated shoulders and caused permanent nerve damage. These punishments were often imposed after long workdays, ensuring maximum physical and psychological impact. Prisoners emerged broken, injured, or dead. The camp's punishment yard became a stage for ritualized cruelty. Executions were conducted openly, reinforcing the consequences of defiance. Prisoners were forced to watch hangings, sometimes standing for hours while the bodies remained suspended as warnings. These spectacles were meant to erase any illusion of dignity. Even death was turned into a tool of control, stripped of privacy and humanity. The SS also employed collective punishment, a strategy that deepened mistrust among prisoners. If one person escaped, spoke out, or failed to meet expectations, entire barracks or work details could be punished. Food rations were reduced, work hours extended, or privileges revoked. This ensured that resistance carried consequences not just for the individual, but for everyone around them, discouraging solidarity and fostering resentment. Surveillance was constant. Guards observed from towers, patrols moved unpredictably, and informants existed within the prisoner population. Even whispered conversations carried risk. This environment made planning nearly impossible and ensured that most energy was spent simply enduring the present moment. Sleep deprivation was another weapon. Roll calls could be extended for hours, particularly after escapes or administrative errors. Prisoners stood motionless, often in extreme weather, while guards counted and recounted. Collapse during roll call was common and frequently fatal. The body, already weakened by starvation and labor, was pushed beyond its limits through these rituals of control. Medical punishment also played a role. Those deemed troublesome, weak, or undesirable could be subjected to experimental procedures, denied treatment, or selected for transport to killing centers. The infirmary became a place of fear rather than refuge. Prisoners avoided it unless absolutely necessary, knowing that admission could be a one-way path. In this system, illness itself became grounds for punishment. The architecture of Neuengamme reinforced this regime of fear. Barbed wire, guard towers, floodlights, and fences created an environment of constant exposure. There were no hidden corners, no private spaces. Even within barracks, bunks were stacked tightly, eliminating personal boundaries. This physical design mirrored the psychological aim of the camp: total domination. Every movement, every breath was subject to scrutiny. Yet even within this crushing structure, control was never absolute. Acts of resistance existed, though they were quiet and fragile. Prisoners shared information, warned each other of inspections, and sometimes sabotaged tools or slowed production in subtle ways. Cultural resistance also emerged. Whispered prayers, remembered poems, fragments of songs passed from bunk to bunk. These acts were small, but they preserved identity in a system designed to erase it. The SS understood the power of these gestures and worked relentlessly to suppress them, but they could never fully extinguish the human need for meaning. Punishment at Neuengamme reveals how the camp functioned not just as a place of confinement, but as a laboratory of control. Violence was calculated, rationed, and deployed strategically. Fear was sustained through unpredictability, public spectacle, and collective responsibility. In this environment, survival required constant vigilance and adaptation. The camp did not merely punish bodies. It trained minds to accept suffering as normal, silence as safety, and obedience as the only path forward. By mastering this system of control, Neuengamme became more than a single camp. It became a model of how terror could be organized, administered, and maintained over time. This architecture of fear would later be replicated across the Nazi camp network, proving that mass oppression does not rely on chaos alone, but on systems carefully designed to make cruelty routine. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Nazi War Economy. By the time Neuengamme entered its full operational phase, the camp was no longer merely a site of imprisonment and punishment. It had become a critical component of the Nazi war economy. Forced labor was not incidental to Neuengamme's purpose. It was its central function. The camp existed to extract as much labor as possible from human bodies deemed disposable, converting exhaustion, suffering, and death into bricks, weapons, infrastructure, and profit. This transformation did not happen spontaneously. It was the result of deliberate planning by the SS, German industrial firms, and state authorities who understood that war could not be sustained without an enormous, expendable workforce. Neuengamme, with its proximity to Hamburg and major transport routes, was ideally positioned to serve this need. From the earliest days, prisoners were compelled to work under conditions that violated every principle of human endurance. The original brickworks near the Dove-Elbe Canal became the camp's economic heart. Prisoners dredged clay, molded bricks by hand, fired them in kilns, and transported heavy loads for hours on end. The work was back-breaking and relentless. Tools were primitive, safety non-existent, and quotas intentionally set beyond realistic capacity. Falling behind invited punishment. Collapsing often meant death. Starvation rations ensured that bodies deteriorated rapidly even as demands increased. The SS understood this dynamic well. Labor was designed not to preserve workers, but to consume them. As Germany's war expanded, so did Neuengamme's role. The camp's labor force was leased out to private companies, state construction projects, and military industries. Prisoners were sent to build roads, repair bomb damage, dig canals, and construct defensive positions. Others were assigned to armaments production, shipyards, and aircraft component factories. These work details often operated under SS supervision but served civilian contractors who benefited directly from the exploitation. For these companies, prisoners were ideal laborers, unpaid, replaceable, and controlled through terror. For the SS, labor contracts generated enormous revenue, reinforcing the camp system as both an ideological and economic enterprise. Workdays stretched from dawn until nightfall regardless of weather. Rain, snow, heat, and cold were irrelevant. Prisoners worked in thin uniforms, wooden clogs, or bare feet. Frostbite and heat exhaustion were common, yet rest was rarely granted. Injuries were treated as failures, not accidents. A broken limb or infected wound often led to selection for execution or transfer to killing centers. In this way, labor became a filter. Those who could no longer produce were eliminated. The system required constant replenishment. As prisoners died, new transports arrived to replace them. This cycle ensured that Neuengamme maintained output even as mortality soared. The expansion of forced labor led to the creation of dozens of satellite camps across northern Germany. These subcamps extended Neuengamme's reach into cities, factories, and rural construction sites. Prisoners were housed in improvised barracks, warehouses, or abandoned buildings, often with even worse conditions than the main camp. Oversight was minimal, brutality frequent, and death rates extreme. The dispersal of labor sites also made Neuengamme harder to dismantle and easier to conceal. Suffering was spread across the landscape, hidden behind industrial walls and military secrecy. The ideology behind this system was explicit. Nazi doctrine framed prisoners as enemies of the state whose lives had no intrinsic value. Labor was portrayed as both punishment and utility, a way to extract benefit before inevitable death. This logic erased moral restraint. Efficiency replaced ethics. Paperwork tracked output, hours, and losses with clinical precision. Human beings were reduced to numbers on reports, units of labor to be allocated and discarded. The SS prided itself on this efficiency, viewing the camp network as a modern solution to political repression and economic demand. Yet the system was deeply wasteful in human terms. The constant destruction of workers through starvation, disease, and violence undermined productivity, requiring endless transports to maintain capacity. This inefficiency did not concern camp authorities. Death was not a failure of the system, it was an accepted outcome. In some cases, it was the goal. Particularly harsh labor details were assigned deliberately to those marked for elimination, ensuring they would be worked to death without the need for direct execution. Prisoners were acutely aware of these hierarchies. Certain work details carried reputations as death sentences. Others offered marginally better chances of survival, though none were safe. Competition for assignments sometimes emerged, forcing prisoners to navigate a brutal calculus. choosing between exhausting labor that might extend life or easier work that could attract suspicion and punishment. These choices were shaped by rumor, observation, and desperation. The camp system thrived on this uncertainty, keeping prisoners divided and focused on immediate survival rather than collective resistance. Despite this, acts of defiance occurred within the labor system. Sabotage was subtle and dangerous. Prisoners dulled tools, misaligned parts, slowed output, or damaged materials whenever possible. Such actions carried enormous risk. Discovery meant torture or execution. Yet these acts mattered. They represented refusals to fully comply, moments where prisoners asserted agency within a system designed to erase it. For many, labor was both the site of greatest suffering and the only remaining space for resistance. The forced labor regime at Neuengamme reveals how the Holocaust functioned not only as a campaign of racial annihilation but as an economic system. Violence and profit were intertwined. Industry and ideology reinforced one another. The camp did not exist on the margins of German society. It was integrated into its economy, supported by contracts, logistics, and administrative cooperation. Understanding this reality challenges any notion that the camps were isolated aberrations. Neuengamme shows how modern states can mobilize bureaucracy, industry, and terror to normalize exploitation on a massive scale. Labor was not simply stolen, it was weaponized. And through it, the camp sustained both war and mass death simultaneously. Chapter 3, Segment 2, Daily Life Under Labor, Discipline, and Punishment. Inside Neuengamme, forced labor was inseparable from an all-encompassing system of discipline designed to control every movement, thought, and breath of the prisoner population. Each day began before dawn with the blaring of whistles and shouted commands that tore prisoners from shallow, exhausted sleep. Roll call followed, often lasting for hours in freezing rain, snow, or blistering heat, as SS guards counted and recounted skeletal figures standing motionless in formation. The dead were dragged from bunks and propped upright so the numbers would match. Only after this ritual humiliation did work details march out, often running to their assigned labor sites. Time was a weapon. Delays were punished. Weakness was interpreted as defiance. Once at work, supervision was constant and brutal. Capos, prisoners appointed by the SS, enforced discipline with clubs, fists, and boots, knowing their own survival depended on productivity and cruelty. The SS deliberately selected capos from criminal categories, encouraging violence between prisoners and eroding solidarity. This structure allowed terror to function efficiently, with minimal direct intervention. At the brickworks, in construction brigades, or at distant industrial sites, the rhythm was relentless. Lift, carry, dig, mold, haul, repeat. Conversation was forbidden. Looking up invited blows. Falling behind invited punishment. Punishments were public by design. Prisoners were beaten in front of their work units, forced to perform exhausting physical drills, or hung by their arms from posts for hours. Some were sentenced to the camp bunker, where isolation, darkness, and starvation broke bodies and minds alike. Others were selected for execution under the guise of disciplinary measures, their deaths recorded as administrative outcomes rather than crimes. Hunger amplified every cruelty. Rations were calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to extract labor. A piece of bread, thin soup, occasional margarine, never enough to restore strength. Starvation distorted behavior, eroded moral boundaries, and turned scraps into objects of desperate conflict. Illness spread rapidly through overcrowded barracks where sanitation barely existed. Dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis thrived, yet medical care was minimal and often punitive. The camp infirmary, far from a place of healing, functioned as a sorting mechanism. Those deemed unfit for work were frequently sent onward to death, either through lethal injections, execution, or transfer to killing centers. Medical staff participated in selections, reinforcing the illusion of legitimacy through white coats and paperwork. Work assignments defined chances of survival. Some details were known as extermination through labor units, canal digging, rubble clearing, or winter construction with inadequate clothing. Others, such as workshops or kitchen labor, offered marginally better conditions but were closely monitored and easily revoked. Favor could turn to death overnight. This instability kept prisoners constantly off balance, focused on immediate endurance rather than long-term hope. The SS cultivated unpredictability deliberately. Rules changed without warning. Punishments were arbitrary. Collective penalties were imposed for individual infractions, ensuring that fear spread horizontally as well as downward. In this environment, time itself became unbearable. Days blurred into one another, measured only by pain, hunger, and exhaustion. Nights offered little relief. Barracks were overcrowded, lice-infested, and suffocating. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by screams, coughing, and the constant anxiety of morning roll call. Yet even here, fragments of humanity survived. Prisoners whispered stories, shared crumbs, warned one another of impending inspections. Some formed clandestine support networks based on nationality, language, or political affiliation. These bonds were fragile and dangerous, but they mattered. They preserved memory and dignity in a place designed to erase both. Resistance, when it occurred, was quiet and calculated. Tools were sabotaged. Output was slowed subtly. Instructions were misunderstood on purpose. These acts carried lethal risk, but they represented a refusal to become entirely obedient. The camp administration responded with harsher discipline, reinforcing the cycle of labor and terror. As the war intensified and bombing raids struck Hamburg, Neuengamme's labor demands increased further. Prisoners were forced to clear debris under dangerous conditions, working amid unexploded ordnance and collapsing structures. Deaths mounted, yet production quotas remained unchanged. Efficiency mattered more than life. By reducing human beings to expendable labor units, the camp system fused ideology with economics. Suffering was not a byproduct. It was the method. Neuengamme's daily routine demonstrates how total control is constructed, not only through violence, but through schedules, regulations, and the normalization of cruelty. Each workday reinforced the message that survival depended on submission, and that even submission offered no guarantee. In this way, labor at Neuengamme was more than work. It was a continuous assault on body and will, a process engineered to exhaust, degrade, and ultimately destroy those trapped within it. Chapter 3, Segment 3, Hunger, Disease, and the Systematic Collapse of the Body. By the time prisoners at Neuengamme adapted to the rhythms of forced labor and punishment, another, quieter weapon had already taken hold. One that required no guards, no clubs, and no shouted orders. Hunger. It worked slowly, relentlessly, and with mathematical precision. Food rations in Neuengamme were never designed to sustain life. They were calculated to extract maximum labor before inevitable collapse. Breakfast was often nothing more than a bitter liquid resembling coffee. Midday meals consisted of watery soup made from turnips, cabbage, or rotten vegetables, often without fat or protein. Evening rations provided a small portion of bread, sometimes adulterated with sawdust or fillers, and occasionally a scraping of margarine or sausage. Caloric intake rarely exceeded a fraction of what the body required for heavy labor. Over weeks and months, this deficit hollowed prisoners from the inside out. Muscles wasted, wounds refused to heal, teeth loosened, vision blurred. Men aged decades in a single season. Hunger reshaped behavior. Prisoners searched garbage pits, chewed grass, stole potato peels, and risked execution for a mouthful of scraps. Moral boundaries eroded under the pressure of survival. The SS understood this effect and exploited it deliberately. Starving people were easier to control, easier to break, and less capable of resistance. Alongside hunger came disease, spreading unchecked through conditions engineered for contamination. Barracks were overcrowded far beyond capacity. Wooden bunks stacked 3 levels high held bodies packed together so tightly that turning over at night required coordination. Blankets were insufficient, clothing inadequate, and washing facilities either non-existent or inaccessible after exhausting workdays. Lice-infested seams, skin, and straw mattresses carrying typhus, a disease that thrived in precisely these conditions. Dysentery swept through the camp due to contaminated water and overflowing latrines. Tuberculosis spread silently through weakened lungs. Fever became constant. Diarrhea robbed bodies of what little nourishment they received. Medical care was not designed to heal but to classify. The camp infirmary functioned as a bureaucratic checkpoint, not a hospital. Prisoners reported sick were examined briefly, if at all, and sorted according to usefulness. Those deemed temporarily salvageable were returned to work. Those judged permanently weakened were removed from the system, sometimes transferred to killing centers, sometimes executed within the camp, sometimes left to die untreated. Doctors and medical staff participated fully in this process, cloaking selections in clinical language. Death certificates listed causes like heart failure or natural causes, disguising starvation and neglect as inevitability. This medicalization of death was central to the camp's operation. It allowed mass killing to occur without visible violence, maintaining the illusion of order. Disease outbreaks triggered collective punishment rather than care. Entire barracks were quarantined without additional food or medicine, accelerating mortality. Corpses accumulated faster than they could be removed. Prisoners were forced to transport the dead, friends, relatives, strangers, stacking bodies in courtyards or near cremation facilities. The constant presence of death reshaped perception. It became ordinary. Survival meant stepping over corpses on the way to roll call, sleeping beside the dying, accepting that tomorrow might bring the same end. Psychological collapse followed physical decline. Prisoners described a narrowing of time, where the future ceased to exist and the past became painful to remember. Only the next hour mattered. Only the next task. This mental constriction was not accidental. It was the result of prolonged exhaustion, fear, and deprivation. The SS relied on this collapse. Broken prisoners were compliant prisoners. Yet even here, fragments of resistance persisted. Some prisoners saved crumbs for those weaker than themselves. Others shared knowledge about avoiding selections or conserving strength. Older prisoners taught newcomers how to survive the first weeks, how to walk without drawing attention, how to fake health during inspections, how to endure hunger without panic. These acts did not stop the system, but they disrupted its absolute control. As the war progressed and Germany's resources dwindled, conditions worsened further. Rations shrank. Medical supplies vanished. Evacuations from other camps flooded Neuengamme with emaciated prisoners, overwhelming infrastructure entirely. Disease exploded. Mortality rates soared. The SS responded not by improving conditions, but by accelerating removals, transports, executions, and abandonment. By late 1944 and early 1945, Neuengamme was no longer merely a labor camp. It had become a mass death site through neglect. People died not in moments of spectacle, but in endless, unrecorded suffering. Hunger and disease accomplished what bullets and gas could not do as quietly. This phase of the camp's existence reveals the full extent of Nazi logic. Killing did not require constant violence. It required systems that made death unavoidable. By stripping prisoners of food, sanitation, medical care, and rest, the camp transformed the human body into a failing machine. Collapse was inevitable. In Neuengamme, starvation and disease were not side effects of war. They were deliberate tools, integrated into the camp's design, enforced through policy, and hidden behind paperwork. This was destruction without noise, death without drama, and suffering stretched across endless days until bodies simply stopped functioning. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Punishment as Policy. Terror, discipline, and public violence. By the time Neuengamme had expanded into a central hub of forced labor and mass death, punishment was no longer a response to disobedience. It had become a governing principle. Discipline in the camp was not meant to correct behavior. It was designed to terrorize the entire prisoner population through spectacle, unpredictability, and absolute humiliation. The SS believed that fear worked best when it was visible, arbitrary, and constant. Every prisoner understood this instinctively within days of arrival. Rules were rarely written, often contradictory, and enforced at the whim of guards and capos. Obedience did not guarantee safety. Innocence offered no protection. Punishment could be triggered by exhaustion, illness, misunderstanding, or nothing at all. This uncertainty was deliberate. It ensured that fear followed prisoners into every moment of camp life, into labor details, barracks, roll calls, even sleep. Punishments ranged from beatings and deprivation to execution, and each served a specific psychological purpose. Prisoners accused of minor infractions, working too slowly, failing to salute, speaking out of turn, were beaten publicly with sticks, whips, or rifle butts. These beatings were rarely brief. They continued until the victim collapsed, lost consciousness, or stopped moving. Others were forced to stand for hours or days in stress positions, arms raised, knees bent, often outdoors regardless of weather. This standing punishment caused swelling, nerve damage, and collapse. Yet survivors were still expected to return to work immediately afterward. Food rations were reduced or removed entirely as punishment, accelerating starvation. Entire barracks could be punished collectively, reinforcing the idea that individual suffering endangered everyone. More severe punishments were staged deliberately to be seen. Hangings were conducted in front of assembled prisoners during roll call. Victims were sometimes forced to read their own sentences aloud before execution. The SS understood the power of ritual. These executions were slow, often botched, prolonging death while forcing thousands to watch in silence. Prisoners were forbidden to look away. Guards monitored reactions closely, punishing anyone who showed visible emotion. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was not only futile, it would be publicly erased. Isolation cells, known as bunkers, were another central tool of control. These small concrete rooms were dark, airless, and often flooded with cold water. Prisoners confined inside were deprived of food, light, and human contact for days or weeks. Many emerged physically broken or mentally shattered. Some did not emerge at all. The bunker served as both punishment and threat. Its presence alone shaped behavior across the camp. Capos played a crucial role in enforcing terror. Selected from the prisoner population, often criminals or individuals willing to demonstrate extreme brutality, they acted as extensions of SS authority. Their survival depended on their cruelty. Capos beat fellow prisoners harder than guards, imposed impossible work quotas, and decided who would be reported, punished, or sent for special treatment. This system fractured solidarity. It forced prisoners into impossible moral positions, obey, brutalize others, or die. The SS relied on this internal violence to maintain control while minimizing their own effort. One of the most insidious aspects of punishment at Neuengamme was its normalization. Violence became routine. Screams blended into background noise. Corpses were removed with efficiency, without ceremony. New arrivals were quickly taught through observation how punishment worked. Fear became a form of education. The camp did not need constant orders. Its rules were written into bodies, scars, and memories. As the war progressed and pressure on the Nazi system increased, punishments intensified rather than diminished. Exhausted prisoners were beaten for collapsing. Sick prisoners were punished for reporting illness. Desperation itself became a crime. The SS interpreted suffering as evidence of guilt, weakness, or sabotage. In this way, punishment justified itself endlessly. This system achieved more than compliance. It dismantled identity. Public humiliation stripped prisoners of dignity. Arbitrary violence destroyed trust. Constant fear prevented long-term planning or resistance. Neuengamme functioned not only as a site of forced labor and death, but as a laboratory of domination, where terror was refined, standardized, and exported across the camp network. In Neuengamme, punishment was not an exception. It was the language of power. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Medical Abuse, Experimentation, and the Destruction of the Body. At Neuengamme, the human body was no longer regarded as something to be healed, protected, or preserved. It became an object, something to be tested, exploited, exhausted, and discarded. Under the language of medicine and research, the SS transformed suffering into data and death into procedure. What occurred inside the camp's infirmaries and experimental blocks was not accidental cruelty or the result of neglect. It was a deliberate extension of Nazi ideology, where science was stripped of ethics and turned into another weapon of control. Medical abuse at Neuengamme followed a grim logic. Prisoners were first broken by labor, starvation, and punishment. Then, once weakened, they were subjected to experiments that ensured they would never recover. Doctors did not work to save lives. They worked to observe how quickly bodies failed, how long a human being could survive without food, with infected wounds, with untreated disease, with chemicals injected directly into muscle and bloodstream. The goal was not knowledge for healing. It was efficiency in destruction. One of the most infamous series of experiments involved tuberculosis. Prisoners were deliberately infected with the disease, often through injections or exposure in enclosed spaces. Once symptoms developed, coughing blood, fever, extreme weight loss, treatment was withheld. Instead, doctors observed progression, testing vaccines or chemical compounds without consent. Many subjects died slowly, choking as their lungs collapsed. Others were executed once data had been collected, their deaths logged as natural causes. The records survived. The people did not. Children were not spared. Jewish children and other young prisoners were selected for medical experiments because their bodies were considered useful for long-term observation. Some were injected with bacteria. Others were operated on without anesthesia. Many were killed to conceal evidence when the experiments ended. Their names were often replaced with numbers, their existence reduced to entries in a ledger. Neuengamme's doctors understood that children left witnesses behind, and witnesses were dangerous. The camp infirmary itself was a place of terror rather than relief. Prisoners avoided it whenever possible. To be admitted often meant selection for experimentation, neglect, or death by injection. Overcrowded rooms held the sick, starving, and dying together without sanitation or adequate care. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis spread unchecked. Doctors performed selections among the sick, deciding who might be returned to labor and who would be sent for special treatment. These selections were final. Those deemed unfit were removed quietly, often never seen again. Medical killing was carried out with chilling efficiency. Lethal injections of phenol or air were administered directly into the heart. Victims often died within seconds. Others were sedated and taken away under the pretense of transfer. Their bodies were cremated or buried without record. Death certificates, when issued at all, listed false causes: heart failure, weakness, infection, disguising murder as inevitability. Doctors were not acting alone. Nurses, orderlies, and SS administrators cooperated fully. The medical system at Neuengamme was integrated into the camp's machinery of death. It complemented forced labor by ensuring that exhausted prisoners were eliminated rather than treated. It reinforced discipline by making illness a liability. And it served ideological goals by framing mass murder as scientific necessity. What makes the medical crimes at Neuengamme especially disturbing is their banality. There were no dramatic confrontations, no chaotic violence. Experiments were scheduled, notes were taken, reports were filed. This bureaucratic calm gave the illusion of legitimacy. Behind white coats and clinical language, the SS hid acts that violated every principle of medicine. Healing became indistinguishable from killing. As Allied forces approached and the camp system began to collapse, efforts were made to erase evidence. Records were destroyed. Surviving experimental subjects were murdered. Entire wards were emptied through execution or evacuation. The SS understood that medical crimes were among the most damning. Yet fragments survived. Testimonies, documents, memories carried by those who lived long enough to speak. Neuengamme demonstrates a terrifying truth. Genocide does not require rage or chaos. It can be carried out calmly, professionally, under the guise of care. When ethics are removed and obedience replaces conscience, medicine itself can become an instrument of annihilation. Here, bodies were not healed. They were studied until they failed, and then they were erased. Chapter 4, Segment 3, Punishment, Terror, and the Architecture of Fear. At Neuengamme, terror was not random. It was engineered. Punishment was not simply a response to resistance or disobedience. It was a permanent condition of existence, woven into the daily structure of the camp. Every rule, every formation, every command was designed to remind prisoners that their lives were completely disposable, and that suffering could arrive at any moment without explanation or appeal. Fear was not a byproduct of the system. It was the system. The camp operated under an internal hierarchy that amplified cruelty. SS guards stood at the top, wielding absolute authority. Beneath them were prisoner functionaries, capos, block elders, work supervisors. Many selected precisely because they were willing to enforce brutality in exchange for slightly better conditions. This structure ensured that violence flowed downward constantly. Prisoners were not only terrorized by the SS, but by one another, forced into roles where survival required participation in oppression. The system fractured solidarity and replaced it with suspicion and fear. Punishments at Neuengamme were deliberately public. Beatings took place in open yards, often during roll call, where thousands were forced to watch. Prisoners accused of minor infractions, standing incorrectly, failing to salute, collapsing from exhaustion, stealing scraps of food, were whipped until they lost consciousness or died. The goal was not discipline alone, but demonstration. Every act of punishment was a message. This is what happens to those who fall out of line. One of the most feared punishments was the so-called hanging post. Prisoners had their hands bound behind their backs and were suspended from a beam or hook, dislocating shoulders and tearing muscles. Some were left hanging for hours. Others were beaten while suspended. Many died slowly, suffocating or succumbing to shock. Survivors carried permanent damage. Arms rendered useless, nerves destroyed, pain that never faded. The punishment left no visible wounds at first, but it permanently crippled the body. Cells known as standing cells or dark cells were another instrument of terror. Prisoners were locked inside spaces so small they could not sit or lie down. Some were kept in complete darkness for days. Food and water were withheld. The psychological impact was devastating. Disorientation, hallucinations, and panic became common. When prisoners were released, they often emerged barely able to walk, trembling uncontrollably, their minds as broken as their bodies. Executions were carried out with calculated restraint. Unlike extermination camps, Neuengamme did not rely on gas chambers in its early years. Instead, death came through shooting, hanging, lethal injection, starvation, and exhaustion. Executions were often staged to appear orderly, almost bureaucratic. Prisoners were called by number, marched away, and never returned. Others were forced to witness the deaths, ensuring that terror spread far beyond the victims themselves. The gallows were a permanent presence. Prisoners knew where they stood. Some executions were announced in advance. Others happened without warning. Resistance fighters, escapees, and those accused of sabotage were often executed publicly. Bodies were sometimes left hanging as a warning. The silence that followed was as powerful as the violence itself. No one spoke. No one moved. Survival depended on learning when not to react. Psychological terror was constant. Prisoners were subjected to endless roll calls, sometimes lasting for hours in freezing temperatures or rain. Sick prisoners were forced to stand until they collapsed. Those who fell were beaten or removed for special treatment. The purpose was not administrative accuracy. It was domination, the breaking of will through exhaustion and humiliation. Humiliation itself was a weapon. Prisoners were stripped naked during inspections. Heads were shaved. Personal belongings were confiscated. Names were replaced with numbers. Identity was erased deliberately. To exist at Neuengamme was to be reduced to a body that could be worked, punished, or destroyed without consequence. This loss of identity deepened despair and made resistance more difficult. Children and adolescents were not spared these punishments. Young prisoners were beaten, starved, and subjected to the same terror as adults. Some were used as examples precisely because their suffering was more shocking. The SS understood that fear multiplied when innocence was destroyed openly. Even death did not end punishment. Corpses were treated with indifference or contempt. Bodies were piled, dragged, or left exposed. Funerals were forbidden. Mourning was dangerous. Prisoners learned to grieve silently or not at all. Emotional attachment itself became a risk. As the camp expanded and conditions worsened, punishment intensified. Overcrowding increased tension. Starvation made minor conflicts lethal. The SS exploited this chaos, encouraging brutality between prisoners while maintaining ultimate control. The result was a camp where violence felt omnipresent, unpredictable, unavoidable, and normalized. Neuengamme's system of punishment reveals a core truth about Nazi terror. It was not built solely on mass killing, but on sustained psychological destruction. The goal was to strip prisoners of dignity, hope, and resistance long before death arrived. To make obedience automatic. To make fear permanent. Here, survival required silence. Here, pain was policy. Here, terror was architecture, built into every hour of every day. And for tens of thousands of prisoners, there was no escape from it. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Nazi War Economy. By the early 1940s, Neuengamme had fully transformed from a place of imprisonment into a central engine of exploitation. The camp no longer existed merely to punish or isolate perceived enemies of the Reich. It existed to extract everything of value from human beings: strength, skill, endurance, and finally life itself, in service of Germany's expanding war economy. Forced labor was not a secondary function of Neuengamme. It was its core purpose. From dawn until nightfall, prisoners were driven into exhausting labor details that sustained both the camp and the Nazi state. Roll calls began before sunrise, regardless of weather. Men stood motionless for hours, emaciated bodies shaking in the cold, while SS guards counted and recounted them. Only after this ritual humiliation were work columns formed. Prisoners were then marched under guard to factories, construction sites, quarries, workshops, docks, and satellite camps spread across northern Germany. The work was relentless. At Neuengamme itself, prisoners were forced to produce bricks from the camp's clay pits, a task that became infamous for its brutality. Clay extraction required prisoners to dig heavy, waterlogged soil with primitive tools, often knee-deep in mud. The clay was then transported by hand or cart, shaped into bricks and fired in kilns. Each stage demanded immense physical effort from bodies already weakened by starvation. Those who slowed were beaten. Those who collapsed were removed and rarely seen again. Brick production was not symbolic labor. It served real economic goals. Neuengamme's bricks were used in massive SS construction projects, including barracks, military facilities, and envisioned monumental architecture for a future Nazi empire. Prisoners were literally forced to build the infrastructure of the regime that was destroying them. Their labor became embedded in walls, roads, and factories across Germany. As the war intensified, Neuengamme's labor system expanded rapidly. The SS entered into contracts with German companies, providing prisoners as unpaid laborers. Private firms, state industries, and armaments manufacturers all benefited. Shipyards along the Elbe River used prisoners for heavy dock work. Armaments plants exploited skilled prisoners as machinists and metalworkers. Chemical factories exposed workers to toxic substances without protection. Construction companies consumed human lives as if they were raw materials.
Satellite qu'en multiplide.
By the later years of the war, Neuengamme controlled more than 80 subcamps scattered across northern Germany. These sites were often closer to industrial facilities than the main camp and were even more lethal. Prisoners were housed in makeshift barracks, warehouses, tunnels, or abandoned buildings. Food was scarcer. Medical care was non-existent. Workdays stretched to 12 or 14 hours. Mortality rates soared. The Nazi leadership justified this exploitation through ideology and bureaucracy. Prisoners were categorized as expendable. Reports described them in terms of productivity, efficiency, and loss rates, language borrowed from economics rather than humanity. If a prisoner died, another could be delivered. Labor quotas mattered more than survival. Death was not a failure of the system, it was an accepted outcome. Skilled laborers faced a different but equally dangerous fate. Engineers, carpenters, electricians, and technicians were sometimes spared immediate execution because their skills were valuable. But this did not mean safety. Skilled prisoners were worked until exhaustion, denied proper nutrition, and punished harshly for any perceived mistake. Their usefulness merely delayed death. It did not prevent it. Women and children were also pulled into forced labor as the war progressed. Female prisoners were assigned to textile work, munitions assembly, cleaning, and agricultural labor. Children, some barely in their teens, were forced to carry loads, sort materials, or work in workshops beyond their physical capacity. The regime showed no concern for age or vulnerability. Productivity was the only measure that mattered. Accidents were frequent and fatal. Heavy machinery crushed limbs. Construction collapses buried workers alive. Chemical exposure burned lungs and skin. Guards rarely intervened to help. Instead, they punished prisoners for slowing production. Injured workers were often sent back to barracks to die or transported away under the label of unfit for labor. Starvation was integral to the system. Food rations were deliberately insufficient to sustain heavy labor. Prisoners were given watery soup, scraps of bread, and occasional margarine, barely enough to keep them standing. As weight dropped and muscles wasted, productivity declined. Those who could no longer work were labeled useless and removed from labor lists. Removal often meant death. The forced labor system also served a psychological purpose. By tying survival directly to productivity, the SS forced prisoners into impossible choices. Exhaust yourself and live another day, or collapse and be eliminated. This dynamic crushed morale and turned time itself into a weapon. Every hour of labor extended suffering while offering only the faintest chance of survival. Neuengamme's role in the war economy exposes one of the most disturbing truths of the Nazi system. Genocide and industry were not separate processes. They were interconnected. Mass murder was enabled by modern logistics, accounting, contracts, and schedules. Killing did not interrupt production. It was built into it. By the mid-war years, Neuengamme had become a vast labor reservoir feeding the Reich, a place where human beings were consumed at industrial scale. Every brick fired, every weapon assembled, every dock repaired carried the invisible cost of human lives ground down through forced labor. And as Germany's military situation deteriorated, the demands only increased. The camp would work its prisoners harder, feed them less, and discard them faster. The system had no brakes, only bodies to burn. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Punishment, Control, and the Architecture of Fear. Forced labor at Neuengamme could not function on exhaustion alone. To sustain the system, the SS built an environment where fear was constant, unpredictable, and absolute. Punishment was not merely a response to disobedience. It was a method of control, woven into daily life so deeply that prisoners learned to police themselves in order to survive. Every movement, every breath, every mistake existed under the shadow of consequences that were deliberately brutal and often fatal. Discipline in Neuengamme began with total surveillance. Guards, capos, and prisoner functionaries monitored behavior at all times. Work details were watched closely for signs of slowing, weakness, or resistance. Even facial expressions could be interpreted as defiance. A stumble, an incorrect tool, a miscount during roll call, any of these could trigger punishment. The rules were intentionally vague, ensuring that no one ever felt safe. Beatings were the most common form of punishment. Prisoners were struck with sticks, whips, rifle butts, or fists, often in front of others. These beatings were not quick or restrained. They were prolonged, methodical, and meant to humiliate as much as to injure. Guards targeted the head, kidneys, and spine, causing internal damage that frequently led to death days later. Medical treatment was rarely provided. The suffering was intended to linger. Public punishment served a specific purpose. Executions, floggings, and torture were carried out in view of assembled prisoners to reinforce obedience. The SS understood the power of spectacle. When a prisoner was beaten until unconscious at roll call, hundreds of others watched in silence, knowing that tomorrow it could be them. Fear spread faster than any command. One of the most feared punishments was standing punishment. Prisoners were forced to stand motionless for hours or even days, often outdoors, regardless of weather. Snow, rain, heat, or cold made no difference. Arms raised, legs locked, eyes forward. Movement meant immediate violence. Many collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. Those who fell were dragged away, sometimes beaten further, sometimes never seen again. Hanging punishments were also used. Prisoners were suspended by their wrists behind their backs, causing shoulders to dislocate and nerves to tear. This torture left lasting damage even if the victim survived. Others were tied to posts, whipped repeatedly until skin split open. Infection was common. Death often followed. The camp's punishment cells, dark, cramped spaces designed for isolation, broke prisoners psychologically. In these cells, inmates were deprived of light, food, and human contact. Some were kept in complete darkness for days. Others were forced to stand in coffin-like compartments barely large enough to breathe. Time lost meaning. Many emerged disoriented, weakened, or mentally shattered. Arbitrary punishment was essential to the system. Even prisoners who followed orders perfectly could be punished without explanation. This randomness ensured that no behavior guaranteed safety. The message was clear. Survival depended not on justice, but on chance. The SS held absolute power over life and death, and they exercised it unpredictably to maintain dominance. Capos played a complex role in this structure. Often prisoners themselves, they were granted authority in exchange for enforcing discipline. Some were criminals elevated by the SS, others political prisoners forced into impossible positions. Capos controlled work pace, distributed food, and administered punishments. Their brutality varied, but the system encouraged cruelty. Kindness was dangerous. Weakness could mean removal and death. Psychological terror was constant. Loudspeakers blared orders and threats. Sirens interrupted sleep. Dogs were unleashed to intimidate or attack. Prisoners were forced to witness executions, sometimes of people they knew. The SS understood that fear could exhaust a person more completely than labor. Terror drained hope, reduced resistance, and accelerated physical decline. Collective punishment was another weapon. Entire barracks could be punished for the actions of one individual. Food rations would be cut. Roll calls extended for hours. Work details intensified. This practice turned prisoners against one another, eroding solidarity and encouraging self-policing. Survival became an individual struggle within a collective nightmare. Escape attempts were rare and almost always fatal. When discovered, escaped prisoners were publicly executed or tortured. Their bodies were sometimes displayed as warnings. Those suspected of aiding them were punished as well. The camp was designed to crush the idea of escape before it formed. Language itself became a tool of control. SS reports described punishments in bureaucratic terms: disciplinary measures, special treatment, protective custody. These euphemisms masked violence and made cruelty administrative. By reducing suffering to paperwork, the system normalized abuse and insulated perpetrators from moral responsibility. Even death was regulated. Executions were scheduled. Corpses were counted. Punishment became routine, mechanical, efficient. The terror was not chaotic, it was organized. Fear followed rules just like labor quotas and roll calls. For prisoners, punishment blurred into daily existence. Hunger, pain, humiliation, and exhaustion merged into a single continuous experience. There was no safe moment. No refuge. No guarantee that tomorrow would be any different from today. Neuengamme was not sustained by violence alone, but by the anticipation of it. Prisoners learned to move carefully, to speak softly, to disappear into work. They learned that obedience did not ensure survival, it only delayed death. And yet, even within this architecture of fear, something stubborn endured. Because despite the beatings, the isolation, and the calculated terror, not every prisoner broke. Some endured, some remembered, some waited, and beneath the surface of control, resistance, quiet, fragile and dangerous, was beginning to take shape. Chapter 5, Segment 3, Resistance in Silence, Surviving a System Designed to Break You. In a place like Neuengamme, resistance did not begin with weapons or open defiance. It began with survival itself. The camp was engineered to eliminate individuality, to reduce people to labor units, to strip away identity, dignity, and hope until nothing remained but obedience or death. Under such conditions, even the smallest act of human will become dangerous, and therefore powerful. Resistance at Neuengamme was quiet, fragmented, and often invisible. It took shape in whispers rather than shouts, in shared glances rather than speeches. Prisoners understood that open rebellion meant immediate execution, collective punishment, or annihilation of entire barracks. To resist and live, they had to do so carefully, patiently, and often invisibly. One form of resistance was mutual aid. In a system built to encourage selfishness and betrayal, sharing food was an act of defiance. A crust of bread broken in half, a spoonful of soup passed silently, a moment of rest offered to someone on the edge of collapse. These small gestures kept people alive longer than the SS intended. They also preserved something the camp sought to destroy: solidarity. Political prisoners, especially communists and social democrats, were often the first to organize informal networks. Many had experience in underground movements before their arrest. In Neuengamme, they used that knowledge to create covert systems of support. They helped place weaker prisoners into less lethal work details when possible. They passed warnings about upcoming selections or punishments. They memorized names, dates, and events, determined to bear witness if they survived. Information itself became a form of resistance. News from outside the camp, smuggled through civilian workers, sympathetic guards, or newly arrived prisoners, was shared carefully. Rumors of Allied advances, of Germany losing the war, spread quietly through barracks. Even uncertain hope mattered. It gave prisoners a reason to endure one more day. Some prisoners resisted by sabotaging production. In armaments factories and workshops, they worked slowly when guards were distracted, damaged tools, misaligned components, or produced faulty parts. These acts were incredibly risky. Discovery meant torture or death. But even small disruptions mattered. They reminded prisoners that they were not entirely powerless. Cultural resistance also survived in hidden forms. Prisoners recited poetry from memory, whispered prayers, taught one another languages, mathematics, or history during brief moments of rest. These acts preserved identity in a place designed to erase it. For Jewish prisoners, religious observance, even in the smallest form, became an assertion of humanity against annihilation. Children and younger prisoners found ways to resist through imagination. Games played in secret, stories invented in whispers, drawings scratched into dirt. These moments did not change the system, but they preserved the inner world that the SS could not fully control. Medical resistance existed as well. Prisoner doctors and nurses, working with almost no supplies, hid the sick, falsified records, and delayed reporting deaths to protect those who might otherwise be selected for execution or transport. These acts were exhausting and dangerous, but they saved lives. Resistance also meant memory. Prisoners memorized names of the dead, the dates of executions, the names of SS officers, the structure of the camp. They knew the Nazis intended Neuengamme to disappear, physically and historically. By remembering, prisoners defied that plan. Survival meant testimony. As the war turned against Germany, resistance became more complex. The SS grew more paranoid. Punishments intensified. Evacuations loomed. Prisoners understood that the camp's final phase could be the most lethal. Death marches, mass executions, and deliberate starvation became real possibilities. In these final months, resistance shifted toward endurance. Staying alive was itself a victory against a system that demanded death. Each breath taken, each day survived, undermined the Nazi goal of total erasure. Not everyone could resist. Many were too weak, too sick, too exhausted. Their deaths were not failures. They were victims of a system designed to make survival exceptional. Resistance was never a moral obligation, it was a fragile possibility. And yet, the fact that resistance existed at all is one of Neuengamme's most important truths. Because despite the fear, the punishments, and the machinery of control, the SS never fully succeeded in turning prisoners into what they wanted them to be. They wanted silence. They wanted obedience. They wanted disappearance. What they got instead were witnesses. Men who shared food when they had none. Women who remembered names when memory itself was dangerous. Prisoners who carried the truth inside them long enough to tell it. Neuengamme was built to break people. It did not succeed completely, and as the war moved closer to Germany's borders, as Allied forces advanced, and as the SS began to prepare their escape, the camp entered its final, most chaotic chapter. One where terror, desperation, and survival collided. That is where the story now turns. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The collapse begins. When the war reached Neuengamme. By late 1944, the world outside Neuengamme was changing, and the camp felt it before it ever saw it. The thunder of Allied bombing grew closer. Supply lines fractured. Guards whispered. Orders became erratic. The Nazi system that had operated with ruthless efficiency for years was beginning to crack, and inside Neuengamme, that collapse did not bring relief. It brought escalation. As Germany lost ground on every front, the concentration camp system shifted into its most dangerous phase. Camps were no longer just sites of imprisonment and forced labor. They became dumping grounds for human beings the Reich no longer knew how to control. Neuengamme, already overcrowded and lethal, began receiving waves of prisoners evacuated from camps in the east as the Red Army advanced. These transports were not rescues. They were transfers of death. Men arrived after weeks on trains with no food, no water, no sanitation. Many were already dying when the boxcar doors opened. Some were dead. Others collapsed onto the platform and were dragged or beaten toward roll call. The SS registered them quickly, stripped them of what little they carried, and sent them straight into barracks that could no longer contain the living. Overcrowding reached catastrophic levels. Barracks built for a few hundred now held thousands. Prisoners slept pressed together on wooden planks or bare floors, unable to turn without disturbing others. Air grew thick with sickness. Lice multiplied uncontrollably. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation spread faster than any prisoner network could contain. Food rations shrank further as Germany's supply system disintegrated. Soup became thinner, bread portions smaller. Starvation was no longer gradual, it was visible. Bodies shrank into skeletal frames. Faces hollowed. Eyes dulled. Prisoners no longer had the strength to stand through roll call. Falling meant beatings. Staying down meant death. The SS responded not with relief, but with punishment. As order collapsed, violence intensified. Guards lashed out unpredictably. Executions increased. Discipline became arbitrary. A glance, a misstep, a moment of weakness could result in fatal consequences. The system no longer pretended to follow rules, it functioned on panic and cruelty. Forced labor continued even as prisoners lost the strength to work. Neuengamme remained tied to Germany's war economy until the very end. Men were driven into brickworks, construction sites, armament workshops, and satellite camps despite malnutrition and disease. Productivity collapsed, but the punishment for failing quotas did not. Work became a sentence without purpose. Labor for labor's sake, death through exhaustion. The SS also began to prepare for something else: disappearance. As Allied forces closed in, orders came from Berlin to evacuate camps, destroy evidence, and eliminate witnesses. Neuengamme was not to be liberated intact. It was to be erased. Records were destroyed. Crematoria were pushed beyond capacity. Mass graves appeared. Prisoners were transferred again and again, not to save them, but to scatter them across collapsing territories where survival was unlikely. Fear spread through the barracks. Prisoners understood what evacuation meant. Death marches had already become infamous. Those too weak to walk would be shot. Those who collapsed would be left behind. Winter conditions made survival nearly impossible. And yet, staying behind carried its own dangers. No one knew whether the SS would abandon the camp or liquidate it. Inside this uncertainty, survival became even more precarious. Prisoner resistance networks struggled to adapt. Information was scarce. Rumors contradicted one another. Some believed liberation was imminent. Others feared annihilation before Allied arrival. Both possibilities felt equally real. Despite this, acts of humanity continued. Prisoners helped one another hide during selections. They shared information about evacuation routes. They tried to conserve energy for what might come next. Some prepared mentally for marching. Others clung to the hope of staying alive long enough to see the gates open. Neuengamme, once a symbol of systematic control, was now a place of chaos. But chaos did not mean mercy. It meant unpredictability, and unpredictability killed just as effectively as policy. The collapse of Nazi Germany did not end suffering inside the camp. It intensified it. As the Reich fell apart, Neuengamme entered its deadliest phase, not because the system was strong, but because it was desperate. And desperation, armed with power, was still lethal. The final months were approaching, and with them came evacuation, death marches, and decisions that would determine who lived long enough to witness the end. That is where the story moves next. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Evacuation Orders, Death on the Move. By early 1945, the war had reached Neuengamme in a way no bomb ever could. The front lines were closing in, and with them came orders from the highest levels of the SS. The camps were not to be liberated. The prisoners were not to be found alive. Neuengamme, like so many other camps across the collapsing Reich, was to be emptied, not for mercy, but for erasure. Evacuation did not mean safety. It meant death in motion. The SS began issuing orders with frantic urgency. Transports were organized hastily, without planning, food, or medical care. Prisoners were ordered to assemble with no explanation. Many were too weak to stand. Others had no shoes, no coats, no strength left in their bodies. Still, they were forced forward, driven out of the camp gates into a world that had already decided they were disposable. Those selected for evacuation were marched through northern Germany in columns that stretched for kilometers. Guards surrounded them with rifles and dogs. Anyone who slowed the pace was beaten. Anyone who fell was shot. The roads filled with corpses, bodies left where they dropped, sometimes pushed into ditches, sometimes left in the open as warnings to those still walking. Winter conditions made survival nearly impossible. Snow, cold rain, and freezing winds cut through striped uniforms that offered no protection. Feet bled inside wooden clogs or bare soles. Hunger reached absolute levels. Prisoners scavenged grass, bark, and scraps from roadsides. Some drank from puddles or melted snow, knowing it could bring sickness, but thirst left no choice. For many, evacuation meant sealed transport trains, boxcars packed far beyond capacity. Hundreds were forced inside cars designed for livestock. There was no sanitation, no water,
No ventilation.
The doors were sealed from the outside. Trains sat idle for days as rail networks collapsed under Allied bombing. Inside, men suffocated, froze, or died of thirst. By the time doors were opened, many were already dead. These transports did not have clear destinations. Some were rerouted repeatedly. Others were abandoned. SS guards often fled when Allied aircraft appeared, leaving prisoners locked inside cars or stranded along rail lines. In some cases, civilians discovered these trains days later, filled with corpses and survivors too weak to speak. Neuengamme itself was dismantled rapidly. Barracks were emptied, records destroyed, evidence burned or buried. The SS attempted to wipe the camp from existence before Allied troops could document it. But the prisoners carried the truth with them, in their bodies, their memories, and the trails of death left behind. Not everyone was evacuated at once. Some prisoners were moved to satellite camps or work details until the final days. Others were held back to maintain infrastructure or clean the camp before its abandonment. These men lived under constant fear that they would be executed once their labor was no longer needed. Inside the evacuating columns, bonds formed under unimaginable pressure. Prisoners supported one another physically, holding up those who could no longer walk. Some took turns carrying the weakest. Others shared the last scraps of food or whispered encouragement through cracked lips. These acts did not guarantee survival, but they preserved humanity in a world designed to erase it. SS guards, meanwhile, operated in a state of panic. Some remained brutally committed to orders. Others became erratic, violent, or drunk. Discipline broke down. Executions occurred without reason. A glance, a word spoken in the wrong language, a failure to respond instantly could mean death. The death marches from Neuengamme merged with evacuations from other camps, creating vast moving populations of prisoners across Germany. Roads became corridors of suffering. Villages witnessed columns of skeletal men passing through, living evidence of crimes that could no longer be hidden. By the time Allied forces reached the region, Neuengamme's prisoners were scattered across northern Germany, the Baltic coast, and improvised holding sites. Many would not live to see liberation. Others would be freed only days after surviving marches that had killed thousands. Evacuation was not an end to the camp. It was its final weapon. Neuengamme no longer needed fences or watchtowers to kill. The system had learned to murder through movement, through exhaustion, exposure, and abandonment. The Reich was collapsing, but its machinery of death continued to function until the very last moment. And still, the suffering was not yet over. For some prisoners, the journey ended not on roads or rails, but at sea. That story comes next. Chapter 6, Segment 3. The Ships in the Bay, Death After the Camp. As the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, Neuengamme's final chapter unfolded far from its barracks and watchtowers, on the cold waters of the Baltic Sea. What happened there would become one of the least understood, most tragic episodes of the Holocaust's final days. A catastrophe born not of gas chambers or executions, but of chaos, secrecy, and a system still determined to erase its victims even as it fell apart. By late April, thousands of prisoners evacuated from Neuengamme and its satellite camps were transported north toward the port city of Lübeck. They were weak, starving, many barely alive after weeks of death marches and sealed train transports. They were told nothing. Some believed they were being moved to Sweden for exchange. Others feared mass execution. The truth was far more terrifying and tragically absurd. The SS had decided to remove these prisoners from land altogether. In Lübeck Bay, several large passenger ships lay anchored. The Cap Arcona, the Vielbeck, and the Deutschland. Once luxury liners, they had been stripped of their civilian purpose. The SS ordered thousands of prisoners to be forced aboard these vessels. There was no preparation for survival. The ships were not stocked with food, water, or medical supplies. Sanitation was non-existent. Prisoners were packed deep into cargo holds, sealed below decks, guarded by SS men who themselves had little idea what would happen next. Why the prisoners were placed on the ships remains one of the darkest unanswered questions of the war's final days. Some historians believe the SS intended to sink the ships themselves, killing all witnesses. Others argue the SS hoped to use the prisoners as bargaining tools. What is certain is that the prisoners were treated as expendable, hidden away where their deaths would leave little trace. Conditions aboard the ships were unbearable from the first hours. The holds were dark, airless, and crowded beyond capacity. Men fainted where they stood. Others suffocated slowly as oxygen disappeared. Drinking water ran out almost immediately. Hunger, already extreme, became lethal. The sick lay on top of the dying. The dead were left where they fell, because there was nowhere to move them. SS guards remained on deck, armed and isolated from the human catastrophe below them. Then, on May 3, 1945, the final disaster struck. British Royal Air Force aircraft appeared over Lübeck Bay. To Allied intelligence, the ships looked like evacuation transports possibly carrying fleeing SS personnel. No markings indicated prisoners were on board. No warnings were given. Rockets and bombs tore into the vessels. The Thielbeck was hit first. It sank rapidly. Hundreds trapped below decks drowned within minutes. The Cap Arcona was set ablaze. Flames spread through the ship as prisoners inside screamed and clawed for exits that had been sealed. Those who managed to escape into the freezing water were often shot by SS guards or mistaken for enemy soldiers by aircraft strafing the surface. The sea became a grave. Thousands of prisoners died in the water, burned alive, crushed inside the sinking hulls, or shot as they struggled to survive. Bodies washed ashore for weeks afterward. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms scattered along the coastline like wreckage. Local civilians were ordered to collect and bury the dead, often in mass graves, under SS supervision that lasted until the very last days of the war. Few survived. Those who did were often rescued by fishermen or Allied troops who arrived too late to stop the tragedy but just in time to witness its aftermath. Survivors spoke of the horror with disbelief, that after enduring years of camps, forced labor, starvation, and marches, death had come in the final hours through a mistake layered on top of deliberate cruelty. The sinking of the Cap Arcona and Thielbeck became one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history, and one of the least known. Unlike other camp crimes, there were no ruins to photograph, no liberated barracks filled with survivors. The evidence lay beneath the sea. Neuengamme itself had ceased to function as a camp days earlier.
SS personnel fled.
Records were destroyed. When British troops finally reached the site, they found an empty compound, eerily intact, scrubbed of prisoners but heavy with the weight of what had happened there. The killing had not ended with the camp's closure. It had simply changed form. For the prisoners who died in Lübeck Bay, liberation was hours away but unreachable. The Neuengamme system had followed them to the very end, proving a final, brutal truth. The machinery of Nazi terror did not stop when the fences came down. It continued through evacuation, concealment, and abandonment, right up until the Reich's last breath. Yet even in this final catastrophe, witnesses survived. Their testimony would force the world to confront not just what Neuengamme had been, but how far the system was willing to go to erase its crimes. That reckoning begins next. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Liberation without prisoners. Discovering an absence. When British forces finally reached Neuengamme in early May 1945, they expected to liberate a concentration camp filled with survivors. What they found instead was something far more unsettling. A camp that was almost empty, intact, orderly, silent, as if its victims had simply vanished. The SS had fled days earlier. Barracks stood in rows. Guard towers remained upright. Administrative buildings were still stocked with files, furniture, and equipment. Workshops contained tools left exactly where they had been used. Kitchens held pots still blackened from cooking. The camp looked operational, but the prisoners were gone. At first, Allied commanders were uncertain what they were seeing. Neuengamme did not resemble the scenes already emerging from camps like Belsen or Dachau, where thousands of survivors staggered behind barbed wire. There were no crowds rushing the gates.
No chairs.
No skeletal figures waving from barracks. Only silence and the faint, lingering smell of death that as British soldiers moved deeper into the compound. The truth began to surface slowly, piece by piece. They found piles of abandoned prisoner clothing stacked in storage rooms. Shoes sorted by size. Shorn hair collected in sacks. Identification tags scattered across office floors. Medical facilities containing instruments stained from use. Punishment cells still locked, with scratch marks on the walls. Crematoria that were cold now but not long abandoned. The absence itself became evidence. Investigators soon learned that Neuengamme had been systematically emptied in the final weeks of the war. Tens of thousands of prisoners had been driven out on death marches, packed into freight trains, or shipped north to the Baltic. Many of them already dead, many more soon to die. What the British were standing inside was not a prison anymore. It was a shell, the infrastructure of terror without its human cargo. As reports came in from surrounding villages, roads, and forests, the scale of what had happened expanded beyond the camp's fences. British patrols encountered mass graves hastily covered with earth. They found bodies lying along march routes, where prisoners had collapsed and been shot. Local civilians described columns of men stumbling through towns under SS guard, leaving corpses behind them like markers of the system's collapse. Neuengamme, it became clear, had not ended. It had dissolved outward. Medical officers soon faced another crisis. Thousands of former Neuengamme prisoners were still alive, but scattered across northern Germany, hospitals, barns, abandoned factories, and refugee camps. Many were beyond saving. Starvation had progressed too far. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis were widespread. Improper feeding could kill as easily as hunger itself. British forces were suddenly responsible not just for liberation, but for reconstruction of bodies, records, and truth. Special investigation teams arrived. They began documenting the camp in meticulous detail. Buildings were photographed. Equipment was catalogued. Surviving records were seized before they could disappear. Witnesses were located and interviewed. Former prisoners, forced laborers, local civilians, and even captured SS personnel. What emerged was the picture of a camp that had functioned as a central node in a vast forced labor empire. Neuengamme had supplied brickworks, armaments factories, construction projects, and military installations. Its satellite camps stretched across northern Germany, each feeding human lives into the Nazi war economy until nothing remained. And yet, for years after the war, Neuengamme would remain largely absent from public memory. Unlike camps liberated with survivors on site, Neuengamme lacked a defining moment of exposure. There were no famous liberation photographs broadcast worldwide. No single iconic image that forced recognition. Its crimes were spread across evacuation routes, shipwrecks, and mass graves, harder to compress into one scene. This absence would shape its legacy. In the immediate post-war months, British authorities focused on stabilizing the region and pursuing justice. SS personnel associated with Neuengamme were arrested where possible. Camp administrators, guards, doctors, and overseers were identified through survivor testimony. Many denied responsibility. Others claimed they had followed orders. Some insisted Neuengamme was merely a labor camp, not a place of death. The evidence told a different story. Death rates, transport records, labor quotas, punishment logs, and survivor accounts revealed a system where survival was never the goal. Neuengamme killed not through sudden extermination alone, but through sustained destruction, starvation calibrated to labor output, medical neglect framed as efficiency, violence normalized as discipline. As war crimes trials began to take shape, Neuengamme slowly re-entered history, not as a footnote, but as a case study in how genocide could operate without gas chambers, how bureaucracy could murder without spectacle. But even as justice efforts began, another struggle emerged: memory. In post-war Germany, Neuengamme's location near Hamburg made it inconvenient. The land was valuable. The past was uncomfortable. For decades, parts of the former camp were repurposed into prisons, warehouses, and industrial facilities. Survivors returned years later to find their place of suffering transformed, not into a memorial, but into something functional, ordinary, forgettable. The camp Germany tried to forget had succeeded in disappearing twice, first by the SS, then by neglect. Yet memory has a way of resurfacing. Former prisoners organized. Testimonies were recorded. Documents were preserved. Pressure mounted. Slowly, painfully, Neuengamme began to reemerge, not as a functioning camp, but as a warning preserved in concrete, brick, and silence. Liberation had not come with celebration here. It came with questions, and those questions would shape everything that followed. Chapter 7, Segment 2, Justice Delayed. The struggle to hold Neuengamme accountable. In the months following Germany's surrender, the question surrounding Neuengamme was no longer what happened, but whether anyone would truly be held responsible for it. Justice did not arrive with liberation. It arrived slowly, unevenly, and often incompletely, shaped by political realities, limited evidence, and a world eager to move on. British military authorities assumed control over the Neuengamme site and its region. Unlike camps liberated with prisoners still inside, Neuengamme required reconstruction of crimes after the fact. The SS had fled with deliberate speed, destroying files, burning records, and dispersing witnesses across a collapsing Reich. What remained were fragments, enough to prove atrocity, but not enough to make accountability easy. Investigators began by piecing together the camp's command structure. Neuengamme had been under the authority of the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, linking it directly to the core of the Nazi concentration camp system. Commandants, labor overseers, medical staff, and guards had rotated through the camp over the years. Some had been transferred elsewhere. Others were dead. Many simply disappeared into post-war chaos. Survivor testimony became the backbone of prosecution. Former prisoners described beatings that ended in death, starvation rations calibrated to break bodies, public executions used as discipline, and medical experiments conducted without anesthesia or consent. They named names. They described faces. They recalled routines so precise they could not have been accidental. But testimony alone was not always enough. Defense attorneys argued that Neuengamme was a labor camp, not an extermination camp. They claimed deaths resulted from wartime shortages, disease, or Allied bombing, not policy. They insisted that individual guards bore no responsibility for systemic outcomes. The language of bureaucracy once again became a shield. The British responded with documentation. Transport lists showing thousands arriving and never leaving. Construction logs revealing forced labor projects tied directly to the war economy. Medical records documenting deliberate neglect. Execution reports hidden under euphemisms like special treatment and disciplinary action. Statistical death rates that far exceeded any civilian standard, even in wartime. Gradually, the narrative shifted. In 1946, the first major Neuengamme war crimes trials began in Hamburg. SS officers, guards, and administrators were brought before British military tribunals. Survivors traveled long distances to testify, some still visibly ill, others speaking through interpreters, many reliving trauma they had spent years trying to suppress. The trials revealed Neuengamme as something more insidious than a single site of cruelty. It was a system, one that fed human beings into factories, quarries, construction projects, and subcamps until they collapsed, and then replaced them with new arrivals. Death was not incidental. It was expected. Several defendants were convicted and sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. Some walked free due to lack of evidence or legal technicalities. Justice, when it came, was partial. And then came silence. As Cold War tensions escalated, priorities shifted. Germany was no longer just a defeated enemy, it was a potential ally.
War crimes prosecution slowed.
Some sentences were commuted. Former SS personnel reintegrated quietly into civilian life. Files were closed. Investigations stalled. Neuengamme receded again, this time into legal obscurity. For survivors, this second erasure was devastating. Many returned to their home countries carrying not only physical scars, but the burden of having witnessed crimes that seemed to dissolve into history without consequence. Some tried to speak publicly. Others remained silent for decades, convinced no one wanted to listen. In Germany, the camp's physical space underwent transformation that mirrored this forgetting. Portions of Neuengamme were converted into a prison complex. Administrative buildings were reused. The camp's original purpose faded beneath new layers of function. For years, inmates served sentences in structures built by former prisoners, often unaware of what those walls had once contained. Commemoration efforts were resisted. Local authorities worried that a memorial would stigmatize the region. Economic concerns outweighed moral ones. Survivors' organizations were told to be patient, to compromise, to accept limited recognition. But memory does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. By the 1970s and 80s, a new generation began asking questions. Students, historians, journalists, descendants of survivors. They uncovered trial transcripts, testimonies, photographs, and burial sites. They challenged the narrative that Neuengamme was marginal or secondary. Public pressure mounted. Gradually, official acknowledgement followed. Sections of the former camp were designated as memorial space. Exhibitions were created. Educational programs introduced. Survivors were invited, sometimes for the first time, to speak at the place where they had nearly died. Yet even then, the struggle continued. Neuengamme's story did not fit neatly into public understanding of the Holocaust. There were no gas chambers on the scale of Auschwitz, no single moment of exposure like Bergen-Belson's liberation. Its cruelty was dispersed, prolonged, bureaucratic, harder to visualize, easier to minimize. And that made it dangerous, because Neuengamme demonstrated something deeply unsettling. That mass death did not require spectacle, could be achieved through routine, through quotas, through paperwork, through indifference layered atop ideology. Justice, when delayed, risks becoming symbolic rather than corrective. Today, Neuengamme stands as a memorial and documentation center. Its buildings no longer function as instruments of terror, but their presence remains, stark, deliberate, unadorned. They ask questions rather than offer comfort. How does a society decide what to remember? Who gets justice and who is forgotten? And how many crimes disappear simply because they lack a single photograph powerful enough to force the world to look? Neuengamme's legacy is not only about what happened there. It is about how long it took for the world to admit that it mattered. Chapter 7. Segment 3. Memory against oblivion. The long fight to remember Neuengamme. Even after the trials faded and the headlines moved on, Neuengamme continued to exist in a dangerous space between knowledge and neglect. The crimes had been proven. The suffering had been documented. And yet, for decades, the camp remained largely absent from public consciousness. Not erased entirely, but quietly sidelined, as if remembering it fully would demand more reckoning than society was prepared to offer. For survivors, the struggle did not end with liberation or testimony. It continued in the years that followed, as they watched the place of their suffering transformed, reused, and normalized. When large portions of the former camp were converted into a functioning prison complex, many felt a profound sense of betrayal. Cells were built where barracks once stood. Guard towers overlooked grounds where executions had taken place. The landscape of terror was repurposed without pause. This reuse was not accidental. It reflected a broader discomfort with the past. Post-war Germany was focused on rebuilding, economically, politically, psychologically. Acknowledging the full extent of sites like Neuengamme threatened that fragile reconstruction. Unlike Auschwitz, whose name had already become synonymous with the Holocaust, Neuengamme represented something more unsettling. How cruelty could exist within ordinary administrative systems, how terror could be embedded in work schedules and construction plans, how death could be achieved without dramatic spectacle. Remembering Neuengamme meant confronting continuity, not rupture. Survivor groups refused to let that happen. Former prisoners organized associations across Europe. They wrote letters, filed petitions, requested access to the site. They returned, sometimes secretly, to walk the grounds and mark places where friends had died. They collected testimonies while witnesses were still alive, knowing time itself was becoming an enemy. Their message was consistent. Neuengamme was not a footnote. It was a core component of the Nazi camp system, and its memory deserved permanence. The resistance they faced was subtle but persistent. Officials argued that resources were limited, that the prison served an important function, that memorialization could occur elsewhere, perhaps through plaques or small exhibitions. The idea of dismantling a working prison to honor victims was seen as impractical, even excessive. But memory does not operate on practicality. In the 1980s, public awareness began to shift. Historical research expanded. Younger Germans questioned the silences they had inherited. Investigative journalists uncovered how deeply Neuengamme had been integrated into the Nazi economy, supplying forced labor to private companies, municipal projects, and wartime industries. The narrative changed from a labor camp where many died to a system designed to exhaust people to death. That distinction mattered. Pressure intensified. In 1989, a partial memorial was established on the site, limited but symbolic. Survivors spoke publicly at Neuengamme for the first time. They named the dead. They described the routines of suffering, the roll calls that lasted for hours, the beatings for collapsing, the hunger that hollowed bodies from the inside. Yet the prison still stood. For many, this coexistence felt intolerable, as if justice had stopped halfway. How could incarceration continue in buildings soaked with the memory of mass death? How could a place of state authority operate atop a site of state crime? The answer revealed how complex reckoning truly was. Only in the early 2000s did a decisive shift occur. After decades of advocacy, the decision was made to close the prison and transform the entire former camp into a memorial and documentation center. It was a monumental act, not just administratively, but morally. The process took years. Walls were removed, structures restored, archival materials assembled, exhibitions designed not to sensationalize, but to explain. Neuengamme was finally presented not as an isolated tragedy, but as a system, one that connected ideology, labor, bureaucracy, and violence into a coherent mechanism of destruction. Importantly, the memorial did not sanitize. It preserved the barracks, the brickworks, the roll call square. It documented the subcamps. It named perpetrators and victims alike. It confronted visitors with the uncomfortable reality that many of those involved were not monsters in the traditional sense, but professionals, clerks, engineers, guards, ordinary men performing extraordinary harm. For survivors who lived to see this transformation, the moment was bittersweet. Recognition arrived, but late. Many had already died waiting for it. Others were too frail to travel. Their testimonies remained, recorded voices echoing through spaces that had once tried to silence them permanently. Today, Neuengamme exists as a place of learning and warning. School groups walk its paths. Researchers study its archives. Descendants search for names. The camp story is now embedded in Germany's memorial landscape, not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary. Yet the danger of forgetting has not vanished. Memory requires maintenance. Context can be stripped away. Denial can resurface. Euphemisms can return. Neuengamme teaches that erasure does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through neglect, reuse, and time. The camp's history forces a difficult question. If a place so lethal could almost disappear, not destroyed, but overlooked, what does that say about how societies choose which victims deserve remembrance? Neuengamme was a camp Germany tried to forget. And in that forgetting lies one of its most important lessons. Because the crimes committed there did not depend on secrecy alone, they depended on normality, on routine, on people doing their jobs. Remembering Neuengamme means rejecting the comfort of distance. It means acknowledging that systems matter, that structures enable cruelty, and that the absence of memory is not neutral, it is dangerous. This is why Neuengamme must be remembered not only as a site of suffering, but as a warning that forgetting itself can become a form of complicity. The camp no longer kills, but its lessons still speak, quietly, persistently, to anyone willing to listen. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Children, Women, and the Undocumented Dead. Neuengamme was built as a camp for political prisoners and forced laborers, but as the war expanded and the Nazi system radicalized, its population changed in ways that exposed the full moral collapse of the regime. By the early 1940s, Neuengamme was no longer a camp holding only adult men deemed enemies of the state. It had become a place where women, children, and entire families were drawn into a machinery of suffering that did not distinguish between age, gender, or innocence. At first, children were not meant to be there. Nazi camp policy assumed that children were either to be killed immediately, deported elsewhere, or left to die through starvation and disease in ghettos. But Neuengamme's expanding network of subcamps, its proximity to Hamburg, and the desperate labor needs of the collapsing Reich gradually erased even those distinctions. Children arrived not as individuals, but as remnants, survivors of transports where their parents had already died, or as part of evacuations from camps further east that were being dismantled ahead of advancing Allied armies. Many arrived alone. They were undocumented, unregistered, and often unnamed. SS records rarely listed children properly. Ages were guessed, names misspelled or omitted entirely. Some children were recorded simply as youth, others as unfit. This bureaucratic vagueness made them especially vulnerable. Without proper registration, they were invisible, uncounted in death, unclaimed in survival. Children in Neuengamme were not housed separately at first. They were forced into adult barracks, where overcrowding, violence, and disease made survival almost impossible. They received the same rations as adults, which meant starvation hit them faster. They were expected to keep up during roll calls that lasted for hours, even in winter. Those who collapsed were beaten or dragged aside, sometimes never to return. Work assignments for children varied, but all were brutal. Some were used as messengers, carrying heavy loads between work sites. Others were assigned to clean latrines, remove corpses, or assist in workshops producing equipment for the war effort. A few were sent to satellite camps connected to armaments factories, where toxic materials and exhaustion destroyed their health in weeks. There was no concept of childhood here, only utility. Women arrived at Neuengamme later, primarily through its subcamp system. As the war intensified, the SS increasingly relied on female forced labor for industries linked to textiles, electronics, munitions, and construction. Women's subcamps were established near factories, often under conditions even worse than those in the main camp. They faced constant hunger, physical abuse, and sexual violence, crimes that were rarely documented and even more rarely punished. Pregnant women were considered a problem. Pregnancy was treated as a defect, not a condition to be protected. Some women were forced to work until collapse. Others were sent to medical blocks where abortions were performed without consent, under brutal and unsanitary conditions. Infants who were born alive often did not survive long. There was no provision for care, warmth, or nourishment. In some cases, infants were deliberately killed. In others, they simply faded, unrecorded deaths in a system designed to erase vulnerability. Medical experiments at Neuengamme included children. This remains one of the camp's most disturbing chapters. In the final year of the war, 20 Jewish children were selected from Auschwitz and transported to Neuengamme. They were used in tuberculosis experiments conducted by SS doctors seeking to advance military medicine. The children were injected with bacteria, subjected to painful procedures, and observed as their health deteriorated. They were never meant to survive. When Allied forces approached Hamburg, the SS decided to eliminate the evidence. The children, along with their caregivers and several Soviet prisoners, were taken to a school building in Hamburg. There, they were murdered, hanged in the basement. Their names were almost lost. For years, the crime remained hidden behind euphemisms and silence. It was only through post-war investigations and survivor testimony that the truth emerged. Today, the children are remembered individually, a rare act of restoration in a system that had reduced them to test subjects. Beyond these known cases lies a larger absence. Thousands of victims at Neuengamme left no trace beyond a transport number or a vague entry in an SS ledger. Children who died within days of arrival. Women whose deaths were recorded without cause. Elderly prisoners who vanished during evacuations. The camp produced death faster than documentation could follow. This is one of Neuengamme's most haunting legacies. Not only the suffering it inflicted, but the silence it left behind. Survivors often spoke of children trying to appear older to avoid selection, of women sharing crumbs to keep infants alive one more night, of prisoners who shielded younger inmates during beatings, knowing it might cost them their own lives. These acts did not change the system, but they mattered. They remind us that even inside a structure designed to strip away humanity, people still recognized one another as human. Neuengamme did not just destroy bodies. It targeted relationships between parents and children, between caregivers and the vulnerable. Punished compassion as weakness. It treated dependency as a crime. Understanding this is essential, because the camp was not only a site of forced labor and execution. It was a place where the most defenseless were deliberately exposed to the harshest conditions, not by accident but by design. Children and women at Neuengamme were not collateral damage. They were part of the system's logic. And their suffering exposes the lie at the heart of Nazi ideology, that violence could be controlled, selective, or justified. Once a system accepts that some lives have no value, there is no limit to who can be destroyed. Neuengamme proved that with terrifying clarity. Chapter 8, Segment 2, Evacuations, Death Marches, and the Disappearing Prisoners. As the war turned decisively against Nazi Germany in late 1944, Neuengamme entered its final and most lethal phase. This was not a period of sudden collapse, but of frantic reorganization. A phase in which the SS attempted to preserve control, erase evidence, and continue exploitation even as defeat became inevitable. For the prisoners, this meant something worse than liberation delayed. It meant motion without mercy. It meant evacuation. By the winter of 1944, Allied bombers dominated the skies over northern Germany. Hamburg burned repeatedly under air raids. Rail lines were damaged, factories destroyed, and the illusion of permanence that had surrounded Neuengamme for years began to fracture. Yet the camp did not empty. It filled. Prisoners poured in from camps further east, Auschwitz, Grossrosen, Stutthof, as the Red Army advanced. These were skeletal survivors of already lethal systems, many arriving after weeks of transport without food or sanitation. Neuengamme, already overcrowded, absorbed them anyway. Barracks meant for hundreds now held thousands. Disease spread unchecked. Starvation deepened. Death accelerated. The SS understood one thing clearly. Neuengamme could not be allowed to fall intact into Allied hands. Orders came down to evacuate. What followed was not an organized retreat, but a series of chaotic removals that historians now recognize as death marches, though many of them involve trains, barges, and forced movements that defy a single label. Prisoners were driven out not to save them, but to eliminate witnesses and maintain the appearance of control. Evacuation lists were drawn up hastily. Names were crossed out, rewritten, replaced by numbers. Many prisoners were never recorded at all. Those deemed too weak to travel were often shot or left behind to die. Others were marched for days through freezing weather, wearing rags, without food, collapsing along roadsides that quickly became mass graves. One of the most infamous evacuations involved the Lübeck Bay. In late April 1945, thousands of Neuengamme prisoners were loaded onto ships, including the Cap Arcona and the Thielbeck, under the pretense of transport. The prisoners were packed into holds, starved, and guarded by SS units. On May 3rd, Allied aircraft attacked the ships, unaware they were filled with concentration camp prisoners. The ships burned and sank. Most aboard drowned or were killed. It was one of the largest single loss-of-life events involving camp prisoners in the war's final days. Those who survived the evacuations faced continued brutality. Some were transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where starvation and typhus raged. Others were sent to smaller camps or forced to wander between collapsing SS commands that no longer had clear orders or supplies. Liberation came unevenly, for some in days, for others in weeks that felt endless. Neuengamme itself was emptied rapidly. As prisoners were driven out, the SS began destroying records. Documents were burned, files removed, barracks scrubbed. Evidence of executions and medical experiments was dismantled. The goal was simple: to leave as little trace as possible. When British forces reached the Neuengamme site in early May 1945, they did not find a functioning camp. They found silence. The barracks stood mostly empty. The crematorium was cold. Tools lay abandoned. Without prisoners present, the scale of the crime was not immediately visible. Unlike camps liberated with survivors inside, Neuengamme revealed its horror slowly, through documents recovered later, through testimonies from survivors found elsewhere, and through the growing realization that thousands who had been held there were simply gone. Many never returned. Families searched for names that did not appear on lists. Survivors spoke of friends who vanished during evacuations, swallowed by roads, trains, ships, and forests. In post-war records, These victims often appear as missing, a term that disguises the truth. They were killed by movement itself. The evacuations were not chaotic accidents. They were deliberate. The SS knew that starvation, exposure, and exhaustion would finish what labor and imprisonment had begun. Evacuation was not an alternative to death. It was a continuation of it by other means. For survivors, these final weeks left deep scars. Liberation brought safety, but also confusion, grief, and guilt. Many had lost everyone they knew in the final marches. Others were too ill to understand that the war was over. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis continued to kill even after guards had fled. Neuengamme's victims did not experience a single ending. Some died in the camp. Some died on the road. Some died at sea. Some survived only to die weeks later in hospitals overwhelmed by the scale of human devastation. And some lived, carrying memories that would become the primary evidence against those who had tried to erase everything. The evacuations reveal something essential about Neuengamme and camps like it. When the system could no longer function as designed, it did not stop. It adapted. It transformed prisons into marches, barracks into transports, camps into moving graves. The goal remained the same: control until the very end, even if that control consisted only of deciding who would die next. Neuengamme did not end with liberation. It dissolved, leaving behind gaps, absences, and unanswered questions that still haunt its history. Understanding this final phase is crucial because it shows that the cruelty of the camp was not tied to a place alone. It followed the prisoners wherever they were driven. The system did not collapse. It chased its victims to the last possible moment. And in doing so, it ensured that many would never be found, never counted, and never named, unless history insists on remembering them. Chapter 8, Segment 3, Liberation Without a Camp, and the Silence That Followed. When British forces finally arrived in the Neuengamme region in early May 1945, they did not encounter the scene that had come to symbolize liberation elsewhere. No mass of prisoners pressing against barbed wire, no SS guards surrendering at the gates, no immediate confrontation with the full machinery of the camp. Instead, they found something quieter, and in many ways more unsettling. Neuengamme had been emptied. The terror had not vanished, it had dispersed. The camp stood largely intact but eerily silent. Barracks remained. Watchtowers still loomed over empty roll call squares. Workshops were abandoned mid-task. The crematorium stood cold, its doors closed. To an outsider, it could have appeared almost ordinary, an industrial compound hastily deserted. But absence itself was the evidence. Tens of thousands of prisoners had passed through Neuengamme, and now almost none remained. This created a unique challenge for the liberators. Without prisoners present, the scale of Neuengamme's crimes was not immediately visible. There were no skeletal survivors to speak on the spot, no overflowing sick barracks to testify instantly to what had occurred. The British soldiers sensed that something was terribly wrong. The stench of decay lingered, mass graves were suspected nearby, but the full truth did not reveal itself in a single moment. It had to be reconstructed. The story of Neuengamme's liberation would therefore unfold backwards. Survivors were found scattered across northern Germany. Some were liberated on roads during evacuation marches. Others were discovered in camps like Bergen-Belsen, already overwhelmed by disease and starvation. Still others were pulled from hospitals, barns, forests, or small towns where they had collapsed after guards fled. Slowly, through fragments of testimony, a picture emerged, not of a single ending, but of a system that dissolved into chaos while continuing to kill. Many of those liberated were barely alive. Years of forced labor had hollowed their bodies. Weeks of evacuation had destroyed what little strength remained. Even after freedom, death followed relentlessly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and extreme malnutrition claimed thousands in the days and weeks after liberation. Doctors faced a new danger. Feeding survivors too quickly could kill them. Recovery itself became a delicate and dangerous process. For Neuengamme survivors, liberation did not feel like triumph. It felt like confusion. The SS guards were gone, but so was any sense of structure. Prisoners who had lived by numbers, commands, and routines suddenly found themselves in a world without instructions. Many did not know where they were, what country they were in, or whether their families were alive. Some had been imprisoned so long that they no longer recognized civilian life. Others were too weak to walk, speak, or even comprehend that the war had ended. Meanwhile, the camp itself entered a strange second life. Instead of becoming an immediate memorial, Neuengamme was repurposed. The British used parts of the site for military purposes. Later, German authorities transformed sections into prisons. Barracks were reused. Buildings were altered. The physical space of the camp was absorbed back into everyday life, even as survivors were still struggling to survive elsewhere. This transformation was not accidental. In post-war Germany, Neuengamme was inconvenient. Unlike camps liberated with dramatic images of survivors at the gates, Neuengamme lacked a single defining moment of exposure. Its victims had been dispersed, its crimes hidden across roads, ships, and forests. There was no single photograph that captured its horror for the world. As a result, it was easier to forget or to postpone remembering. For years, Neuengamme remained largely absent from public consciousness. Survivors fought this silence. They testified in war crimes trials. They wrote memoirs. They returned to the site, sometimes finding it unrecognizable. They searched for the names of friends who had vanished during evacuations, only to discover that records were incomplete or destroyed. Many deaths could not be precisely documented. Many families never received confirmation of how or where their loved ones died. Justice, too, came slowly. Some SS personnel were tried in the immediate post-war years, including in the Neuengamme camp trials held by British military courts. Witnesses described beatings, executions, starvation, and medical abuse. Several perpetrators were convicted and executed, but many others escaped punishment, blending back into civilian life or benefiting from the chaos of post-war reconstruction. As decades passed, Neuengamme became a symbol not only of Nazi cruelty, but of post-war denial and delay. Only after sustained pressure from survivors and historians did the site begin to change. Prisons were eventually removed. Memorials were erected. Archives were opened. Education programs were established. Neuengamme slowly emerged as a place of remembrance rather than erasure. Yet even today, its history carries a warning. Neuengamme shows how a system of terror does not need dramatic finales to succeed. It can end quietly, can disperse its victims. It can rely on bureaucracy, movement, and silence to finish its work. And it can depend on the world's exhaustion to delay accountability. The camp did not vanish because it was unimportant. It nearly vanished because it was too efficient at hiding its final crimes. Understanding Neuengamme's end means understanding that liberation is not always a moment. Sometimes it is a process, one marked by loss, confusion, delayed justice, and long battles over memory. For the prisoners who survived, freedom did not erase what had been done to them. It merely removed the fences. The scars remained, physical, psychological, and historical. Neuengamme's story does not conclude with an open gate. It concludes with a question: what happens when a system designed to erase people nearly succeeds? And who is responsible for ensuring that it does not erase itself from history as well? The answer lies not in the empty barracks, but in the voices that refused to let the silence win. Chapter 9: Segment 1. Trials, Testimony, and the Fragile Search for Justice. When the war ended, the question that followed liberation was deceptively simple. Who would be held responsible? For Neuengamme, this question was especially difficult. The camp had been evacuated, its prisoners scattered, its final crimes spread across evacuation routes, sinking ships, roadside graves, and forgotten forests. There was no single crime scene, no moment of capture that exposed the system in full view. Justice, like memory, would have to be reconstructed piece by piece. In the months after Germany's surrender, British authorities began investigating Neuengamme and its satellite camps. What they encountered was not a neatly documented system, but a deliberate absence of records. The SS had destroyed files, burned documents, and issued last-minute orders to conceal evidence. Many perpetrators had fled. Others had changed uniforms, claimed civilian status, or disappeared into the flood of refugees moving across a shattered Europe. The camp itself, already being repurposed, no longer spoke for its victims. Only people could. Survivors became the primary evidence. Men and women who had endured years of forced labor, starvation, beatings, and terror were now asked to recall details with precision. Names, dates, locations, faces. They were asked to describe crimes that language itself struggled to hold. Many testified while still suffering from illness, trauma, and profound exhaustion. Some collapsed during questioning. Others broke down when confronted with their former tormentors in courtrooms that felt small compared to what they had survived. The Neuengamme camp trials, conducted by British military courts between 1946 and 1948, sought to impose order on chaos. Former SS guards, administrators, doctors, and capos were charged with war crimes, including murder, torture, and inhumane treatment. The courtroom became a space where bureaucratic cruelty was translated into legal terms, where starvation rations, beatings, executions, and forced labor were dissected not as policy, but as crimes. For the first time, the routine violence of Neuengamme was spoken aloud in public. Witnesses described roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing rain. They spoke of punishments designed to break bodies slowly, hanging by arms tied behind backs, beatings for collapsing at work, executions carried out in silence. They described medical experiments, deliberate neglect, and labor quotas that no human could meet. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns. The trials established an essential truth. Neuengamme was not a deviation from Nazi policy. It was a central component of it. Yet justice was uneven. Some perpetrators were convicted and executed. Others received prison sentences. But many escaped accountability altogether. The sheer scale of the Nazi camp system overwhelmed the capacity of post-war courts. Evidence was incomplete. Witnesses died before testifying. Political priorities shifted as the Cold War emerged, and former Nazis were sometimes deemed more useful alive than imprisoned. The pursuit of justice slowed, fractured, and in some cases stopped entirely. For survivors, this was another form of injury. They had endured dehumanization under the SS, only to encounter indifference, bureaucracy, and fatigue in the aftermath. Some felt that their suffering was being measured, categorized, and quietly set aside. Others feared that without visible punishment, denial would take root. Memory, they understood, required more than verdicts. It required recognition. Germany itself struggled with this reckoning. In the immediate post-war years, many Germans framed camps like Neuengamme as aberrations, the work of a few criminals, not a system supported by industry, administration, and society. The fact that Neuengamme's prisoners had been worked for German companies, that civilians lived nearby, that the camp had operated for years within sight of Hamburg, was uncomfortable. It challenged narratives of ignorance and distance. As a result, remembrance was delayed. Survivors returned to Neuengamme in the 1950s and 60s to find prisons operating on the former campgrounds. Execution sites were inaccessible. Mass graves were unmarked. Memorial efforts were minimal or symbolic. The physical space where crimes had occurred was being used, not confronted. This silence had consequences. Without sustained attention, Neuengamme risked becoming a footnote rather than a warning. Younger generations grew up unaware of what had happened near their cities. The camp's role in forced labor and mass death was overshadowed by more infamous sites. The absence of dramatic liberation images allowed denial and minimization to creep in. Survivors responded by organizing. They formed associations, preserved documents, recorded testimonies, and pressured governments. They returned again and again to the site, demanding acknowledgement. Their persistence transformed memory into an act of resistance, a continuation of survival by other means. Over time, historians joined them, reconstructing Neuengamme's history through archives, testimonies, and forensic research. Justice, in this sense, became cumulative. It was not delivered fully in courtrooms. It was built slowly through documentation, education, and remembrance. Each testimony countered erasure. Each memorial stone resisted forgetting. Each name restored a fragment of dignity stolen by the camp. Neuengamme's legacy, therefore, does not rest solely on sentences handed down decades ago. It rests on a broader understanding that accountability is not only legal but moral and historical. That crimes committed through systems require systems of remembrance to confront them. And that silence, when left unchallenged, becomes an accomplice. The pursuit of justice after Neuengamme reveals a sobering truth. Ending a camp does not end its harm. That harm persists in unanswered questions, unmarked graves, and delayed recognition. Justice, like memory, must be actively maintained or it fades. And in the space where justice fades, denial waits patiently. Neuengamme teaches that remembering is not passive. It is a responsibility carried forward by those who refuse to let the past dissolve into convenience. The trials were a beginning, not an end. Chapter 9. Segment 2. Erasure, Denial, and the Struggle to Remember. After the trials faded from headlines and courtrooms emptied, Neuengamme entered its most dangerous phase. Not violence, but forgetting. Unlike camps that became immediate symbols of Nazi brutality, Neuengamme slipped quietly into obscurity. There were no iconic liberation photographs burned into global memory, no instantly recognizable ruins preserved for the world to see. Instead, the camp became something far more fragile, a place that could be repurposed, explained away, and gradually erased from public consciousness. In the years following the war, the physical grounds of Neuengamme were not treated as sacred or even significant. Much of the site was converted into a prison complex by West German authorities. Barracks that had once held starving prisoners now housed criminal inmates. Guard towers remained, but their meaning was reframed. Execution sites were fenced off or built over. The landscape was altered just enough to blur its past, while leaving enough intact to haunt those who knew where to look. This transformation sent a devastating message to survivors. For those who had endured Neuengamme, the reuse of the camp felt like a continuation of erasure, as if their suffering could be absorbed into routine, normalized by bureaucracy once again. They had survived a system designed to eliminate witnesses, only to watch the evidence of their pain buried beneath administrative convenience. The camp had been designed to destroy bodies. Now, it seemed it was being allowed to destroy memory. Official narratives in post-war Germany often framed the concentration camps as isolated crimes committed by a small circle of fanatics. This interpretation was comforting. It allowed society to distance itself from responsibility, to avoid uncomfortable questions about complicity, profit, and silence. Neuengamme was particularly inconvenient to acknowledge because it was a forced labor camp deeply embedded in the German war economy. Prisoners had worked for local industries, produced materials, and built infrastructure that benefited nearby cities. Remembering Neuengamme meant admitting that terror was not hidden. It was organized, profitable, and visible. As the Cold War intensified, priorities shifted further. West Germany became a strategic ally, and stability was valued over introspection. Former Nazis reintegrated into society. Discussions of guilt were often seen as disruptive or politically dangerous. In this climate, the memory of camps like Neuengamme was not denied outright, it was simply postponed. Silence became policy. School curricula barely mentioned the camp. Public memorials were minimal. Survivors who spoke out were sometimes met with discomfort, disbelief, or fatigue. Their stories disrupted the narrative of recovery and progress. For many Germans, it was easier to look forward than to look back, especially when the past revealed how ordinary structures had enabled extraordinary cruelty. Yet forgetting was never complete. Survivors carried Neuengamme with them in their bodies and minds. Trauma did not fade with time. It transformed. Nightmares, illness, and survivors' guilt followed them for decades. Many struggled to explain their experiences even to family members, not because they lacked words, but because the world seemed unwilling to listen. Silence was imposed externally, but it also took root internally. Gradually, resistance to forgetting began to grow. In the 1960s and 70s, a new generation started asking questions. Students, journalists, and historians began investigating the hidden histories beneath post-war reconstruction. Survivors were invited, sometimes for the first time, to speak publicly. Archives were reopened. Documents long ignored were re-examined. The myth of ignorance began to crack. Survivor associations played a crucial role in this shift. They organized commemorations, collected testimonies, and pressured authorities to acknowledge Neuengamme as a site of mass suffering. Their demands were not abstract. They asked for memorials, educational programs, and unrestricted access to the campgrounds. They asked for names to be remembered, not reduced to numbers. Progress was slow and often resisted. Local governments argued about costs, logistics, and jurisdiction. Prison authorities resisted relocation. Political leaders worried about reopening wounds. Each step toward recognition required sustained pressure. Memory, it became clear, did not assert itself automatically. It had to be fought for. By the late 20th century, the struggle reached a turning point. The prison facilities were gradually removed from the former campgrounds. Memorial spaces expanded. Neuengamme was officially recognized as a concentration camp memorial and educational center. Exhibitions were developed to explain not only what happened, but how it happened, emphasizing systems, responsibility, and human choice. This transformation marked a profound shift. Neuengamme was no longer framed as a tragic anomaly. It was presented as evidence of how modern societies can weaponize order, efficiency, and obedience. The camp became a place to confront uncomfortable truths: that cruelty does not require chaos, that mass suffering can exist within well-organized systems, and that silence enables violence as effectively as commands. Yet even today, remembrance remains fragile. As time passes and survivors die, memory risks becoming abstract. Without living witnesses, the temptation to simplify or sanitize grows stronger. Neuengamme's history challenges easy narratives. It does not offer dramatic moments of rescue or clear moral boundaries. It reveals a slow, grinding destruction carried out through routine, a form of violence that is harder to recognize and therefore easier to repeat. This is why erasure is not accidental. Forgetting benefits those who prefer comfort over responsibility. Denial does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through neglect, omission, and the steady erosion of detail. Neuengamme teaches that memory must be maintained actively, or it will be reshaped to suit the present. The struggle to remember Neuengamme is therefore not only about the past. It is about the future. It asks whether societies are willing to confront how easily institutions can be turned against humanity, and whether they will listen when survivors warn that such systems do not announce themselves as evil. They present themselves as normal. In resisting erasure, Neuengamme stands as proof that remembrance is not guaranteed. It is a choice, one that must be renewed with every generation or lost forever. Chapter 9, Segment 3, Neuengamme's Legacy and the Warning It Leaves Behind. As the 20th century moved toward its close, Neuengamme slowly transformed from a place buried by silence into a site of reckoning. But its legacy was never meant to remain confined to memorial walls or historical archives. Neuengamme endures not simply as a record of what the Nazis did, but as a warning about how easily a modern society can construct systems of cruelty, and how quietly those systems can operate once normalized. Unlike extermination camps designed for immediate death, Neuengamme reveals a different truth about genocide: that mass murder does not always rely on dramatic violence. It can unfold through paperwork, schedules, quotas, and routines. Prisoners at Neuengamme were destroyed not by a single mechanism, but by a convergence of policies: starvation calculated to weaken but not immediately kill, labor demands calibrated to extract maximum output before collapse, medical neglect used as a tool rather than a failure, and punishment systems designed to terrorize through unpredictability. This structure makes Neuengamme especially unsettling. There were no sudden moments where humanity vanished. Instead, it eroded gradually. Guards learned to follow orders without reflection. Administrators learned to optimize suffering. Engineers learned to design facilities that increased efficiency. Civilians learned to look away. The camp functioned because thousands of ordinary decisions aligned toward an extraordinary crime. This is the legacy Neuengamme leaves behind. Proof that evil does not always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it arrives with order. In educational programs today, Neuengamme is increasingly used to teach not only Holocaust history, but civic responsibility. Students are confronted with difficult questions. How does obedience become complicity? When does silence become participation? How do systems remove individual accountability? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they are not confined to the past. They apply wherever power operates without scrutiny. Survivor testimonies remain central to this legacy. Those who lived through Neuengamme often emphasized that the camp did not only destroy bodies, it attempted to erase identity. Prisoners were stripped of names, professions, family ties, and personal history. Survival depended not only on physical endurance, but on holding on to fragments of humanity. Sharing food, remembering birthdays, whispering stories, helping the sick stand during roll calls. These acts did not dismantle the system, but they defied its purpose. In this sense, Neuengamme also stands as a testament to resistance, not only armed resistance but moral resistance. Resistance meant refusing to become numb. It meant choosing solidarity over self-preservation when possible. It meant bearing witness, even when survival seemed unlikely. Many prisoners understood that they might not live to see liberation, but they acted so that someone might remember. That memory now carries responsibility. As generations pass, the danger is not outright denial alone, but distortion. When camps like Neuengamme are remembered only as distant horrors, stripped of context, they risk becoming abstract symbols rather than concrete warnings. The reality is more unsettling. Neuengamme was embedded in society. It relied on civilian contractors, local industries, transportation networks, and bureaucratic coordination. It was not hidden in isolation, it was woven into everyday life. This fact challenges comforting myths. It undermines the idea that such crimes require monstrous individuals alone. Neuengamme shows that systems can be lethal even when populated by people who see themselves as ordinary. It demonstrates how cruelty can be reframed as necessity, efficiency, or duty. Once that reframing succeeds, violence becomes routine. In the modern world, this lesson remains painfully relevant. The language used to justify exclusion, dehumanization, and exploitation often mirrors the past, even when the contexts differ. Neuengamme warns that when groups are reduced to categories, when suffering is hidden behind administrative language, and when responsibility is diffused across institutions, the groundwork for atrocity is laid long before violence becomes visible. Memory, therefore, is not passive. To remember Neuengamme is to resist simplification. It is to insist on detail, names, and systems rather than vague horror. It is to recognize that remembrance must include accountability, not only for perpetrators, but for societies that allowed cruelty to become normal. This is why Neuengamme cannot be treated as a closed chapter. Its lessons demand vigilance. They ask whether modern institutions protect human dignity or merely claim to. They challenge audiences to examine how power operates, how language shapes perception, and how easily people can be trained to obey without questioning outcomes. The camp's legacy also raises a final, deeply unsettling truth: that forgetting is not neutral. When memory fades, space opens for denial, minimization, and repetition. Neuengamme demonstrates that erasure can be just as dangerous as overt hatred. A society that forgets how cruelty was engineered risks rebuilding similar structures under different names. Standing at Neuengamme today, the silence is intentional. It is not the silence of neglect, but the silence of reflection. A space where visitors are meant to confront the weight of what occurred and the choices that enabled it. The absence of noise invites responsibility. It reminds us that remembrance is not about guilt alone, but about awareness. Neuengamme's final warning is clear. Genocide is not an accident of history. It is a process, and processes can be rebuilt. Whether they are stopped depends not on memory alone, but on what societies choose to do with that memory. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Camp After the Camp. When the gates of Neuengamme finally fell silent, the suffering did not end. Liberation did not arrive as closure. It arrived as shock, confusion, and a long, unfinished aftermath that would stretch across decades. For those who survived, the end of the camp marked the beginning of a different struggle. To live with what had been endured, to speak about what many preferred not to hear, and to exist in a world eager to move forward without looking back. In the first days after liberation, the scale of devastation became impossible to ignore. Allied forces encountered prisoners who were barely alive, bodies reduced to skeletal frames, minds fractured by starvation, disease, and relentless terror. Medical teams worked against time, knowing that liberation alone could still mean death. Many prisoners died after freedom, their bodies too weakened to recover. Others survived only through careful, controlled treatment, as even food, a symbol of rescue, could become fatal if given too quickly. Neuengamme itself did not immediately become a memorial. Instead, it became something else entirely. In the years following the war, the site was repurposed, reshaped, and in many ways erased. Buildings were dismantled, barracks were reused, sections of the camp were converted into prisons. The ground that held mass suffering was paved over with ordinary function. For survivors, this transformation felt like a second betrayal, a continuation of the same erasure the Nazis had begun. Germany, devastated and divided, faced enormous pressure to rebuild. In that process, memory was inconvenient. The camp near Hamburg became an uncomfortable reminder of crimes many wished to distance themselves from. Responsibility was deflected. Silence was normalized. The story of Neuengamme faded from public consciousness, even as survivors carried it within them every day. This was not unique to Neuengamme, but here the forgetting was especially pronounced. Unlike Auschwitz or Dachau, Neuengamme lacked an immediate global symbol. There were no iconic gates etched into collective memory. No single photograph defined it. Its crimes were spread across dozens of subcamps, work sites, factories, and evacuation routes. This diffusion made denial easier. It allowed the camp to disappear not through denial alone, but through neglect. For survivors, survival had not ended the trauma. Many returned to lives that no longer existed. Families were gone. Homes were destroyed or occupied by others. Communities had vanished. Some survivors were met with disbelief, discomfort, or outright rejection when they spoke. Others remained silent, not because they forgot, but because the world seemed unwilling to listen. The psychological wounds were deep and lasting. Neuengamme had stripped people of identity for years. After liberation, rebuilding that identity was not automatic. Survivors struggled with guilt for having lived when others did not. They carried memories that intruded into sleep, relationships, and daily life. The camp followed them not as a place but as a presence. Justice, too, arrived slowly and unevenly. While some perpetrators faced trial, many never did. Evidence was lost. Witnesses died. Records were incomplete. Some former SS guards reintegrated quietly into post-war society. Others benefited from the same bureaucratic distance that had protected them during the war. Accountability was partial enough to acknowledge guilt, but not enough to fully confront it. This incomplete justice shaped Neuengamme's legacy. For decades, the camp existed in a state of tension between memory and denial. Survivors and historians pushed for recognition, documentation, and preservation. Local authorities hesitated. Each step toward remembrance required confrontation with the past, with responsibility, and with uncomfortable truths about complicity. Only gradually did Neuengamme begin to reemerge as what it truly was. Memorialization did not come from above. It came from persistence. From former prisoners who returned despite pain. From families who refused silence. From researchers who pieced together fragmented records. From educators who insisted that Neuengamme mattered, not as an isolated crime, but as part of a system that relied on order, obedience, and indifference. As the memorial took shape, its purpose became clear. Neuengamme would not be a place of spectacle. It would be a place of explanation. A place that showed how terror functioned daily. How forced labor connected camps to industry. How administrative decisions translated into human suffering. How ordinary structures became lethal when stripped of moral restraint. The camp's afterlife, therefore, became part of its meaning. Neuengamme was no longer only a site of past atrocity. It became a measure of how societies deal with uncomfortable history. Its long neglect revealed how easily crimes can be buried under reconstruction and routine. Its eventual recognition demonstrated that memory, though delayed, can still be reclaimed. But this reclamation came with urgency. As survivors aged, the risk of forgetting increased. Testimony became finite. Each year, fewer voices remained to speak firsthand. The responsibility to remember shifted, from those who endured to those who inherited the story. Neuengamme's lesson is not confined to what happened inside the camp. It extends to what happened afterward. How long it took to acknowledge. How hard it was to preserve truth. How tempting it was to move on without reflection. The camp did not vanish because it was insignificant. It vanished because forgetting was easier. Chapter 10 begins not with the end of suffering, but with its transformation from lived reality into contested memory. Neuengamme after liberation reveals that the aftermath of atrocity is not automatic justice or remembrance. It is a struggle, one that requires persistence, honesty, and the refusal to allow silence to finish what violence began. The camp ended. The responsibility did not. Chapter 10, Segment 2, Silence, Denial, and the Long Road to Memory. For years after the war, Neuengamme existed in an uneasy half-state, acknowledged in documents, yet absent from public consciousness. It was not denied outright, but it was not truly confronted either. This space between memory and silence became one of the most revealing chapters in the camp's history, because it showed how easily a society can distance itself from crimes once the structures that enabled them have collapsed. In post-war Germany, the priority was survival and reconstruction. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Hunger, housing shortages, and political uncertainty dominated daily life. Within this landscape, places like Neuengamme were seen less as moral imperatives and more as burdens, reminders of a past many wanted to escape. The camp was near Hamburg, a major city struggling to rebuild its economy and identity. Turning Neuengamme into a memorial meant confronting uncomfortable questions about local participation, industrial complicity, and administrative responsibility. So instead, the site was absorbed into normality. Former SS buildings were reused. Barracks were dismantled or repurposed. Most strikingly, large portions of Neuengamme became prisons run by the post-war authorities. Men were incarcerated on the same ground where tens of thousands had died, often without any public acknowledgement of what had occurred there before. The transformation was practical, efficient, and deeply symbolic. The camp was not erased violently. It was erased bureaucratically. For survivors, this was devastating. Those who returned to Neuengamme in the years after the war often found no markers, no explanations, no signs that their suffering had mattered. The absence felt deliberate. It reinforced the fear that the world was willing to accept the results of the camps, the absence of millions, without confronting the process that produced them. Many survivors stopped returning. Others carried their memories in isolation, convinced that speaking would lead nowhere. Denial took many forms. Some claimed ignorance. Others minimized the scale. Some reframed camps like Neuengamme as work camps, stripping them of their lethal reality. Because Neuengamme lacked gas chambers on the scale of Auschwitz, it was easier to misrepresent its function. Forced labor, starvation, disease, executions. These were portrayed as unfortunate consequences of war rather than deliberate tools of destruction. But Neuengamme was not accidental. Every aspect of the camp had been planned. Rations calculated to weaken. Labor quotas designed to exhaust. Punishments structured to terrorize. Medical neglect normalized. This was slow violence, less visible but no less intentional. The difficulty lay in explaining a crime that unfolded through routine rather than spectacle. This complexity made remembrance harder and forgetting easier. It was not until the 1960s, as a new generation began questioning the past, that pressure for acknowledgement grew. Students, historians, journalists, and survivor groups challenged the silence. They asked why sites like Neuengamme had been ignored. They demanded access to archives. They confronted former officials who had quietly resumed public life. This shift did not happen overnight. Each step toward recognition met resistance. Local authorities argued that memorialization would reopen wounds. Some feared economic consequences. Others claimed that Germany had already done enough to confront its past. Behind these arguments lay a deeper discomfort. Remembering Neuengamme meant accepting that its crimes were not isolated acts of fanatics, but the result of cooperation between state, industry, and society. Survivors played a central role in breaking this resistance. Many were elderly by the time their voices were taken seriously. Yet they returned again and again, giving testimony, writing memoirs, guiding tours, answering questions that reopened trauma. They insisted on specificity, on names, numbers, locations. They refused abstraction. Neuengamme was not a symbol to them. It was a place where they had nearly died. Gradually, the narrative shifted. Neuengamme began to be understood not as a peripheral camp, but as a central node in the Nazi concentration camp system. Its network of subcamps, its role in armaments production, its integration with civilian industries, all of this revealed how deeply the camp was embedded in everyday structures. The myth of ignorance weakened under documentation. Memorialization, when it finally arrived, was cautious and deliberate. Rather than monumentalizing the site, the memorial focused on education. Exhibits emphasized processes over shock. Timelines replaced slogans. Personal testimonies countered statistics. The goal was not to overwhelm, but to explain, to show how terror functioned, how compliance accumulated, how ordinary decisions produced extraordinary suffering. This approach reflected the lesson Neuengamme itself taught. The camp was not an aberration. It was an outcome. Its post-war neglect mirrored the same mechanisms that had allowed it to operate in the first place. Distance, diffusion of responsibility, and the preference for normality over confrontation. In this sense, the camp's afterlife became part of its warning. As decades passed, Neuengamme's meaning expanded beyond German history. It became a case study in how societies remember or fail to remember systemic violence. How memorials are shaped not only by what happened, but by what is politically and emotionally tolerable. How silence can persist not because facts are unknown, but because they are inconvenient. Today, the memorial stands where much of the camp once lay. But even now, remembrance is incomplete. The ground still holds traces of erasure. Some structures are gone forever. Some records were destroyed. Some stories died with those who carried them. Memory, like justice, arrived late and never fully. This is why Neuengamme matters. Not because it was forgotten, but because it shows how forgetting happens. Chapter 10, Segment 2, is about this fragile space between knowledge and action, between acknowledgement and responsibility. Neuengamme's long journey into memory reminds us that atrocities do not end when the killing stops. They end only when societies choose to face them honestly and accept the discomfort that truth requires. The camp taught terror. Its aftermath teaches accountability, and both lessons remain unfinished. Chapter 10, Segment 3, What Remains? Responsibility, Memory, and the Warning that Endures. In the end, Neuengamme leaves no simple conclusion, only a responsibility that does not expire. Long after the barracks were torn down, long after the SS disappeared into history, long after the survivors grew old and their voices thinned with time, the camp continues to ask the same question it always has. What allows a society to accept suffering as normal? Neuengamme was not hidden in a distant wilderness. It stood near a major city, tied to factories, construction projects, and transportation networks. Its prisoners were visible. Skeletal men in striped uniforms marched through streets, worked on civilian sites, collapsed in public view. And yet the system endured, not because everyone believed in its ideology, but because enough people adapted to it. This is the most unsettling legacy of Neuengamme, not the cruelty of its guards alone, but the ordinariness of its operation. The camp functioned through forms, schedules, quotas, requisitions, and reports. Death arrived not as chaos, but as routine. Men were not murdered in a single moment. They were consumed gradually, through hunger calibrated by rations, exhaustion measured by output, and neglect justified as efficiency. Violence became procedural. Responsibility dissolved across offices and ranks until no single hand appeared to be holding the knife. After the war, this same diffusion of responsibility returned in another form. Who was accountable for Neuengamme? The guards who beat prisoners? The doctors who withheld care? The administrators who calculated labor needs? The companies that profited from human exhaustion? The officials who reused the site as a prison without explanation? Each layer pointed elsewhere. Each claimed a limited role. Each insisted the crime belonged to someone else. And so, justice arrived fragmented, partial trials, limited sentences, long silences. What remained was memory. Fragile, contested, and often inconvenient. For survivors, memory was never abstract. It lived in bodies permanently damaged by starvation, disease, and forced labor. It lived in recurring dreams, in sudden silences, in names spoken softly and then lost. For them, Neuengamme was not history. It was present. And for decades, they carried that presence into a world that often preferred distance. As memorialization finally took shape, it faced a difficult task. How to represent a crime that unfolded slowly, without spectacle, without a single defining image. Neuengamme did not offer the immediate horror of gas chambers captured in photographs. Its destruction was incremental, bureaucratic, cumulative. To understand it required patience, the very quality that modern memory often lacks. And yet, that patience is precisely the lesson Neuengamme demands. Because camps like Neuengamme did not emerge from madness alone. They emerged from choices repeated, normalized, justified. They emerged from laws that stripped people of rights, from language that dehumanized without appearing violent, from institutions that prioritized order over humanity. They emerged from the belief that suffering could be measured, managed, and ultimately ignored if it served a larger goal. This is why Neuengamme is not only a memorial to the past, but a warning for the present. Its history shows how easily systems can absorb cruelty when it is framed as necessity. How quickly empathy erodes when victims are labeled as categories rather than people. How silence, more than hatred, allows atrocities to continue. Most of those who lived near Neuengamme were not killers. Many were not ideologues. They were workers, clerks, neighbors, people who adjusted, looked away, told themselves they had no power. The camp teaches us what that adjustment costs. Today, the memorial stands not as a finished answer, but as an ongoing question. Each visitor brings their own distance from the events, cultural, generational, emotional. And yet, the site asks everyone the same thing: what would you have accepted? Not what you would have believed, but what you would have tolerated. What would you have called unavoidable? What you would have learned to live with? Because Neuengamme was built on tolerance, not approval. It survived because enough people accepted its existence as part of the landscape. Because suffering became familiar. Because outrage faded into routine. And that is the most dangerous stage of all, when cruelty no longer shocks, when it simply becomes how things are. The men who died at Neuengamme did not leave monuments behind. Many left no graves. Some left no names. What they left instead was evidence that systems matter, that structures shape behavior, that ordinary environments can produce extraordinary harm when conscience is removed from process. Remembering Neuengamme is not about inheriting guilt. It is about inheriting awareness. It is about recognizing how quickly language can be twisted, how easily laws can be weaponized, how efficiently human beings can be reduced to functions. It is about understanding that genocide does not begin with camps. It begins with categories, with permissions, with the quiet decision to let others suffer without intervening. This is the final legacy of Neuengamme. Not a single lesson, but a permanent vigilance. As long as the camp is remembered only as a historical anomaly, its warning is incomplete. But when it is understood as a product of choices, social, political, bureaucratic, its meaning becomes urgent. Neuengamme shows us that terror does not require chaos. It requires cooperation, and that cooperation, once normalized, is the hardest thing to undo. This chapter ends not with closure, but with responsibility, the responsibility to remember carefully, to question systems relentlessly, and to resist the comfort of forgetting. Because the greatest danger Neuengamme poses is not that it will be denied, but that it will be remembered without being understood. And understanding, more than memory alone, is what keeps such places from returning. Neuengamme did not end when the gates were opened. It did not end when the barracks were dismantled, or when the camp disappeared from maps and memory. It ended only in the bodies of those who survived, and in the silence of those who did not. This was a place where suffering was organized, where cruelty was administered through routine, and where human beings were reduced to labor, numbers, and expendable lives. Not hidden in some distant wilderness, but woven into the fabric of ordinary society. Near factories, near homes, near people who learned to look away. Remembering Neuengamme is not about reliving horror for its own sake. It is about understanding how easily systems can normalize injustice, how bureaucracy can erase responsibility, and how silence can become a form of participation. The men who died here left behind no monuments of their own. What remains is the obligation to remember them, not as statistics but as individuals whose lives were taken step by step, policy by policy, decision by decision. As this story fades into the night, let it leave behind one truth. Camps like Neuengamme were not accidents of history. They were choices, and remembering them is not optional because forgetting is how they begin again. May their memory endure, and may understanding guard the future.